He was called Aegon the Conqueror still, though in a world where the dragons never died out, some said they should call him Aegon the Unifier. His descendants, for countless generations, carried his legend forward on the wings of living flame. The Targaryen line was strong, threaded with silver hair and violet eyes, united always by their greatest source of power, the dragons that had come with them from old Valyria. Because the dragons never perished, because their fires never diminished, the shape of Westeros from the moment of Aegon's landing to far beyond took a form unrecognizable to maesters in our own timeline. This is how it happened, in a twisting tapestry of ambition, loyalty, and the roar of wings that beat ceaselessly against the sky. When Aegon Targaryen and his two sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, arrived on the shores of Westeros, the Seven Kingdoms were no more united than specks of sand blowing in the Dornish deserts. Most of those realms were locked in ancient rivalries, old hatreds, and lines drawn in blood across hillsides and valleys. But with them came three dragons, Balerion the Black Dread, Vhagar, and Meraxes. They were monstrous, glorious creatures, each larger and more fearsome than anything Westeros had seen in centuries, if ever. Castles that had never been conquered by siege nor sapped by cunning were forced to submit at the mere threat of dragonfire. The lords who sought to contest Targaryen rule found themselves swallowing their pride when they watched a single pass by Balerion's black silhouette blot out half the sunlight. In that first conquest, House Targaryen established itself not just as a ruling house but as an unassailable dynasty. For in the years that followed, the dragon riders discovered new ways to coax their mounts to breed, and new ways to ensure the hatchlings thrived. The doom that might have come from the Dance of the Dragons, that awful civil war which in another timeline would have spelled the near extinction of the beasts, did not happen in the same way. The rivalries still existed. Targaryens were mortal, though their illusions of grandeur sometimes approached the immortal. And yes, there were battles for succession. Brothers contended with sisters, uncles with nephews, as they had in every great house in Westeros. But never did those battles reach the same fevered pitch, for the Targaryens understood too well that if they loosed every dragon on the battlefield, if they burned the realm in pursuit of a singular crown, there would be no realm to hold. The older ones remembered Valyria, or at least the stories of its doom. The younger ones remembered how quickly power could turn to dust if taken for granted. Most importantly, the presence of so many dragons was a mutual deterrent. Even the most reckless princeling, wanting to lay waste to a rival, would recoil at the thought of unleashing a conflagration that might see the entire land burned black. Yet, in those early days, it was not a sure thing that the dragons would multiply. After the conquest, Rhaenys and Visenya were eager to see new eggs hatch. In this reality, they found success more quickly than they did in the histories that speak of near extinction. Balerion sired clutches with the she-dragons Vhagar and Meraxes, and under the watchful care of the Targaryen brood, at least half of the eggs yielded living young. Some were sickly, others were stunted or developed odd humps or twisted spines. But the Targaryens learned by trial, by error, and by the ancient knowledge Aegon had carried forth from the remains of Valyria. The freshly minted Targaryen monarchy poured resources into building specialized dragon lairs, hidden away from cold winds and set near sulfuric hot springs. They fed the hatchlings with fresh meat from the crownlands and the reach. They enticed new keepers, stable hands, and so-called dragon tenders, with gold enough to last 10 lifetimes if they could but keep the newborn drakes alive. Over decades, the Targaryens refined the entire process until they knew how to coddle a fragile egg, how to assist in the hatching, and how to coax a fledgling dragon into trusting its keepers. Where once the tradition had been that each new Targaryen heir might be gifted a single egg in their cradle, it soon became possible for all Targaryen children to have that honor. And not just Targaryens either. Favored bastards, devoutly loyal knights, and occasionally, in grand gestures of political union, heirs to other great houses were sometimes granted a dragon's egg as a sign of Targaryen favor. As the years stretched into decades, what began as a single family's dominion over the skies became the foundation for a new system of alliances across Westeros. The realm's great houses were proud, but the Targaryens' power was so absolute that to be named a dragon seed, or to be gifted an egg was a privilege beyond measure. Even those who despised Targaryen rule or dreamt of independence could not entirely refuse such an honor. The results were startling. By the time King Aegon I was old and gray. The fear that House Targaryen's power might die with the original trio of dragons had receded. There were now nearly a dozen living dragons of various sizes roosting between Dragonstone and the massive new dragon pit rising on Rhaenys' Hill in King's Landing. Aegon passed the Iron Throne to his sons, and though the realm quaked at the idea of the Targaryens turning upon themselves, the lines of succession were enforced more sternly. The faith had its own quarrels with the Targaryens, especially with their tradition of sibling marriage. Yet the dragons were an ever-present reminder that even the High Septon, in all his piety, could not shift the reality of power in the realm. The faith militant revolted, yes, but never to the devastating extent that might have happened were the Targaryen brood smaller or more vulnerable. Time and time again, envoys from the crown would demonstrate Dragonfire's awesome capability, often lighting the horizon with a carefully controlled blaze as if to say, "This is your fate if you raise swords against us." The uprisings were contained, and the faith bent to Targaryen will, forging a precarious but lasting peace. Thus the Targaryens cemented their dominion. By the end of the first century of Targaryen rule, no man or woman living in Westeros doubted the monarchy's strength. And because the dragons did not die out, because their reign in the skies endured, king after king, queen after queen, held the realm in a near chokehold of absolute authority. The great houses adapted. Baratheon still ruled the Stormlands, Stark still held the North, Lannisters still kept their seat at Casterly Rock, but none tried to secede or instigate open war, for that was to call death from above upon themselves. Even Dorne, which in another timeline had vexed the early Targaryen kings with endless guerrilla fighting, was brought more swiftly into the fold by a mixture of fiery demonstration and cunning marriage pacts. Princess Dyria Martell, or so the stories went, had once offered the head of King Aegon's own men if he dared come to Sunspear unprotected. But in the face of a flight of 4 dragons, her steel will gave way to prudent compromise. The Targaryens did not rely on fear alone. They made alliances in the ways all rulers do: marriages, trade deals, and ensuring local lords retained enough autonomy to feel respected. But the threat of flame was always in the background. The Targaryen monarchy's second century dawned bright with scale and wing. By then, at least 20 adult dragons soared above Westeros. Others had gone off on journeys with Targaryen princes or envoys, traveling as far as Essos. The free cities watched with growing wariness, suspecting that this dynasty of dragon lords would not confine itself to a single continent. Still, the rulers of the 7 kingdoms concentrated their might at home, ensuring the lines of power were not frayed. Feuds among Targaryen kin were mediated by the elder royals, keenly aware that a single misstep could lead to monstrous destruction. When a Targaryen noble felt aggrieved, he might challenge a cousin to single combat on Dragonback. There were a few spectacular trials by combat that ended with roaring flames in the sky, draconic shrieks echoing across the Blackwater Bay. Yet after a handful of these events, it became clear that unleashing dragons in private quarrels was frowned upon by the rest of the family. In addition, dragons themselves seemed disinclined to fight their own kin unless pressed beyond measure. Blood of the same ancestry, or so the Targaryens said, gave the beasts a sense of kinship. Whether that was truth or fancy, enough misfortune befell those who pitted dragon against dragon that most Targaryens found other ways to settle disputes. Still, not all was peace and prosperity. The Targaryens, secure in their might, naturally sought to expand their prestige. A major flashpoint came when King Aenys II Targaryen, known for his love of grand campaigns, decided to press Targaryen influence across the Narrow Sea. He claimed that the Stepstones, those rocky islands teeming with pirates, were a menace to legitimate trade. Under the pretext of establishing a safer sea route, he launched an invasion with half a dozen dragons, each bearing a Targaryen lord or a trusted vassal. The sky rained fire upon pirate strongholds, turning even stone to glowing embers. Within mere moons, the pirates were driven out or annihilated. The Stepstones were claimed as a Targaryen outpost, their new keeps garrisoned with troops loyal to King's Landing. It was a short war but a thunderous one. Merchants from Bravos to Volantis whispered that they had never seen such raw power. The Stepstones remained under the crown's watch, patrolled by a dragon rider or two who used the isles as a vantage point to guard the shipping lanes. Emboldened by this success, Aenys too considered forging deeper into Essos. However, cooler heads in his council reminded him that the free cities were numerous, wealthy, and cunning. If united by a common threat, they might combine their fleets, their sellsword companies, and their resources to become a formidable enemy. A single dragon might burn a city's gate, but 9 or 10 scorpions firing from the walls could bring down a careless mount. The Targaryens, though confident, were not fools. They did not want to invite the same doom that befell Valyria. So Aenys too heeded his counsel and did not push farther. He satisfied his ambition by maintaining Targaryen oversight of the Stepstones and forging alliances with selected magisters from Pentos and Tyros. It was in this era that the Targaryens faced a more subtle threat: their own complacency. With dragons roosting at Dragonstone, in the Dragon Pit, and in hidden lairs across the realm, the monarchy was seemingly invincible. This sense of invincibility sometimes bred carelessness in governance. A few Targaryen kings grew lazy, ruling with coin and intimidation but ignoring the daily needs of the small folk. Others grew decadent, throwing lavish feasts where the shallower courtiers competed in bizarre stunts. Once, an unfortunate jester was told to ride a hatchling around the Great Hall, only to lose a leg to the startled creature's jaws. These rumors filtered into the countryside, stoking resentment among those who never set eyes on a dragon, nor benefited from the crown's enlightened rule. Whispers grew in the dark that the Targaryens were no better than tyrants, that only their dragons preserved a veneer of authority. Yet such mumblings seldom grew into large-scale rebellions. Whenever a lord grew bold enough to proclaim independence, House Greyjoy, House Stark, even House Tyrell at various points, a swirl of scaled wings would appear overhead, reminding them of the might that lurked behind all the Targaryen splendor. No house dared risk a direct confrontation. Gold cloaks patrolled the streets of King's Landing with a renewed sense of swagger, certain that any threat to the city would be swiftly reduced to ash. The Red Keep loomed over the city, and on each tower, small dragon perches were built to accommodate watchful guardians. The Targaryens liked to keep at least one adult dragon on standby in the city at all times, rotating the duty among different riders. This practice reduced the likelihood of conspiracies sprouting in the crownlands themselves. By the middle of the 3rd century of Targaryen rule, the realm was flush with dragons. Some counted more than 30 living beasts. The Targaryen family tree branched in many directions, with various cadet lines forming. These cadet lines were bestowed lesser keeps or given authority over newly built strongholds, each with its own small dragon roost. It was not unheard of for a younger Targaryen prince or princess to adopt a personal sigil that modified the iconic 3-headed dragon. Some changed its color, others combined it with the heraldry of another house through marriage. This era saw the forging of many ephemeral banners that never made it into official heraldry, but in ballads and local lore, one might hear mention of a silver hydra or a winged stag, each presumably signifying a line that mixed Targaryen blood with Baratheon or Valerion or another. But with so many Targaryens came renewed tension over the throne. Whenever a king died, there were always multiple claimants, and though the Great Council of Lords was meant to solve disputes, the presence of dragons often complicated the matter. Who would dare tell a fiery-tempered princess that her younger brother was favored over her if she arrived at the council astride a drake large enough to melt castle walls? Often the solution was to quietly broker deals before the Great Council convened, ensuring that the sibling with the more imposing dragons or stronger alliances had their path smoothed. This led to arrangements that might have seemed questionable, like marrying cousins or forging betrothals at suspiciously young ages, so that the realm would not erupt in a many-sided war of Targaryen pretenders. The maesters recorded that the tension simmered behind every coronation, though it seldom spilled into open war. When conflict did arise, it was measured. One of the most notable episodes came during the reign of King Maelor the Wise, who tried to mediate a deadly quarrel between two of his cousins. Prince Gaemon Targaryen claimed that his father was promised the throne, while Princess Aelina Targaryen contended that an older edict by King Maegor II recognized her line as next in succession. Both had dragons. Gaemon's was a hulking male named Embermaw, while Elena's was a sleek female called Sunscorch. The pair circled each other's territories for months. Gaiman perched often at Harrenhal, for he had married a daughter of the local lord, and Elena frequently stationed herself at Highgarden, for she had strong alliances in the Reach. The realm trembled at the idea of these two meeting in aerial combat, which would surely devastate any region below them if their dragons fought in earnest. King Maelor acted shrewdly. He organized a grand assembly at the Dragon Pit, inviting every Targaryen of name or station to attend. There were more than 50 who answered the call, each wearing the three-headed dragon in some form. Before this entire congregation, Maelor extracted oaths from both Gaiman and Elena, compelling them to swear upon the memory of Aegon the Conqueror. The two claimants were forced to vow they would accept the assembled Targaryens' decision. Then, in a grand spectacle, the question was put to a vote of the entire bloodline. By a margin of a few voices, it was decided that the line of Gaiman's father did not hold as strong a claim as that of Elena's mother, a direct descendant of King Balon the Bold. Gaiman, seething, nearly spurred Embermaw to roast the hall. But seeing the mass of Targaryens, dozens wearing Valyrian steel swords, some holding dragon whips, others accompanied by their own beasts, he realized that to defy them would be death. Unwilling to turn the entire family against him, he relented. Peace was kept. The realm breathed again. These large gatherings of Targaryens, though beneficial at times, also fomented internal politics. Over the decades, countless slights were exchanged. Alliances formed and broken. Families rose and fell. The rest of Westeros watched as if transfixed by a strange dance of dragons. Except, in truth, this dance was more political and less a matter of open war. Yet tensions never entirely vanished. It was rumored that some Targaryens dabbled in darker arts, whispering about the secrets of blood magic or necromancy gleaned from Valyria's old tomes. The Citadel's archmesters decried such rumors as superstitious talk. But the small folk would sometimes claim to see ghostly lights flickering around Dragonstone on certain nights, or hear unearthly howls from the sea caves below. Some said that the Targaryens drew the land's very lifeblood to fuel their draconic empire. None could substantiate these claims, and the monarchy rarely addressed them, letting rumor swirl around them like a cloak of mystique. Because the Targaryens were so focused on internal unity and stable rule, they did not expand overseas in a systematic manner. Instead, they used their might to maintain peace within Westeros, quell piracy, and ensure tribute from the more fractious corners of the continent. The wall in the north was always manned by the Night's Watch, but it received more funding from the crown than in many other timelines, for Targaryen monarchs recognized that the watchers on the wall made for good public relations. It showed they cared about the protection of the realm. Occasionally, a Targaryen prince or princess would venture north with a dragon, partly for spectacle and partly to ensure that wildling raiders understood the futility of crossing the wall. The sight of a pale figure on a flying beast was usually enough to deter any large-scale incursion from beyond the ice. Nevertheless, word drifted south from time to time of strange doings beyond the wall, rumors of undead creatures, white shadows, the stirring of something old. The Starks, who had an unbroken line of lords of Winterfell, often appealed for more men, more resources to guard the north. The Targaryens listened politely but seldom perceived a genuine threat. The knowledge that the crown possessed multiple adult dragons made them assume that any supernatural threat, if it existed at all, could be dealt with swiftly. It was not arrogance, exactly, but a certain confidence that Dragonfire solved many problems. If the others existed, if the White Walkers were more than legend, the monarchy believed that the weight of centuries of draconic might would be enough to drive them back into the shadows. But times changed. By the dawn of the 4th century after Aegon's landing, Westeros was a realm in which House Targaryen had branched into so many lesser lines that it was difficult to keep track of them all. King Rhaegar II Targaryen, a studious man with silver hair and haunting violet eyes, ascended the throne. His reign marked a new era of relative calm. Rhaegar II took great interest in the histories of Valyria, commissioning fresh translations of old scrolls and encouraging maesters to dig deeper into what had once been lost. He also sponsored a wave of building projects, including expansions to the Dragon Pit to accommodate the larger drakes that had been growing over the generations. Some of these beasts were said to rival Balerion in size, though in truth, no dragon had ever quite matched the Black Dread's legendary wingspan. Still, the realm was awash in draconic grandeur, with some Targaryens riding beasts decked in gilded bridles and half-armors emblazoned W. The Flames. Tournaments were held on Dragonback, spectacular shows of acrobatic riding that enthralled small folk and highborn alike. Amid this splendor, new threats stirred. In the Far East, a red priestess of R'hllor spoke of visions of winged shadows and a great darkness that would swallow the world. Some in King's Landing laughed it off as foreign mysticism, but Rhaegar II was not so dismissive. He invited red priests to speak in his court, listening to their prophecies, though he never officially converted. He also invited representatives from the faith, the Faceless Men, and other religious or mystic orders to share their beliefs. King Rhaegar II was fascinated by prophecy and power, seeing in the Targaryen legacy a potential key to whatever cataclysms might come. But in opening his court to all manners of mystics and visionaries, he inadvertently let in conspirators. A secret cult took root in the back alleys of King's Landing, known as the Ashen Flame, whose members believed that the Targaryens were usurping the rightful power of the gods by breeding dragons so freely. This cult quietly recruited among disaffected peasants, fanatics from the faith militants' old lines, and servants in the Red Keep. Their aim was to strike at the Targaryens in a manner that would cut off the monarchy's wings for good. They took inspiration from the ancient tales of how the Dornish had resisted the Targaryens in the earliest years, by stealth, by cunning, by refusing open confrontation. They also studied old texts on how the Valyrian freehold fell. The cause of the doom was lost to time, but the cult believed that certain arcane methods could replicate it, unleashing hidden fires beneath Dragonstone. If they could cause a controlled cataclysm, perhaps the dragons roosting there would be destroyed, and the monarchy would be humbled. All the while, Rhaegar II remained blissfully unaware of the growing threat beneath his nose. He was consumed with unraveling the riddles of prophecy. He believed that, with so many dragons at the Targaryens' command, the world might soon experience a second age of heroes. In his view, the Targaryens could lead humanity against any darkness, forging a bright future for all. Among his many projects was an attempt to unify the realm's faiths under a single council, to emphasize cooperation instead of sectarian strife. He even considered adopting certain aspects of the R'hllor faith, namely the notion of the prince that was promised, to blend with the Seven's teachings, perhaps strengthening the monarchy's moral authority. This caused friction with the High Septon, but Rhaegar II calmly assured him it was all academic interest, not an edict. Meanwhile, the Ashen Flame cult stealthily built up caches of wildfire, purchased through corrupt pyromancers who had parted ways with the Alchemists' Guild. Wildfire, known to burn with unnatural heat and to be nearly impossible to extinguish, was the only substance aside from dragonfire itself that might threaten a nest of dragons. After extensive infiltration, the cult managed to bribe a pair of Dragonstone's lesser custodians, keepers responsible for feeding the younger dragons. Their plan was to smuggle large barrels of wildfire into the undercrofts beneath the hatching chambers. At a chosen hour, they would ignite it, unleashing an inferno that would hopefully spread to the entire fortress, killing dozens of hatchlings and sending a wave of panic through the monarchy. Had the cult succeeded, it might have spelled the greatest blow to Targaryen power since the days of old Valyria. But the conspiracy was foiled, in part because one of the bribed keepers had second thoughts. He confessed to his mistress, a secret paramour of a minor Targaryen prince, and she alerted her lover. The prince rallied loyal guards and the local garrison on Dragonstone to seize the conspirators. The wildfire was discovered, sealed in barrels beneath an unassuming storeroom. A single spark could have ignited a chain reaction that would have reduced the fortress to rubble. The discovery horrified the Targaryen family, prompting immediate arrests throughout King's Landing as the crown sought out anyone connected to the Ashen Flame. King Rhaegar II interrogated the cult's leaders personally. The question of how to punish them was swiftly answered: public execution, likely by dragonfire. Yet Rhaegar II, seeking to understand their motives, listened first to their ravings. They claimed the Targaryens had upset the natural order, that mortals should not command so many dragons, that the realm deserved to be free of draconic tyranny. One captive spat that the Targaryens might walk like men but were devils in silver hair and pale skin. Another raved about the second doom that would befall any who clung to the Targaryen banner. Though many on the royal council urged Rhaegar II to burn them immediately, he insisted on gleaning as much information as possible about their network. Eventually, the Ashen Flame was rooted out, its members scattered, its ringleaders burned on the Field of Ashes, a grim location so named for the occasion. The event shook the monarchy out of its complacency. The revelation that a conspiracy had nearly destroyed one of their prime strongholds and a swath of baby dragons was like a thunderclap. King Rhaegar II enacted new security measures around Dragonstone and the Dragon Pit, commissioning the construction of hidden vaults and fortified lairs. More watchers were employed, and the Alchemists' Guild was strictly regulated, ensuring that wildfire could not be sold under the table. The Targaryens realized that though they sat atop the apex of power, they were not untouchable. The greatest threats might not come from open rebellion but from the shadows. Yet even after stamping out the cult, the monarchy could not entirely quell the undercurrent of resentment that bred such plots. Though House Targaryen had united the realm, centuries of near-absolute power had fostered the perception of tyranny. The small folk might sing songs about the splendor of dragons overhead, but they also worried about the cost. Scorched fields if a dragon was carelessly unleashed, or higher taxes levied to feed the beasts. It became a ritual in some villages to quietly pray that the dragons would pass them by. In the Red Keep, courtiers spoke only in half-whispers of these sentiments. The Targaryens, outwardly confident, recognized that fear and awe were fickle currencies. They needed to be loved as well as feared, or else conspiracies would keep arising. During the latter part of Rhaegar II's reign, he sought to alleviate these tensions by enacting reforms. First, he decreed that any accidental destruction caused by a Targaryen's dragon, for example, if it swooped too low and set a barn ablaze, would be reimbursed by the crown. He also pushed for the creation of a new order of knights called the Winged Protectors, whose sole charge was to rescue and assist small folk affected by dragon-related mishaps. If a farmer's flock was half-eaten by a ravenous drake, or if a village was accidentally scorched during a Targaryen's flight, these knights would appear with compensation and relief efforts. This policy, while expensive, did wonders for the monarchy's reputation in the short term. Rhaegar II also convened a Grand Council of Lords to discuss the future of the realm. He proposed a structured code of dragon usage, stating that no dragon rider might take flight over populous areas without prior notice, and that any violent use of dragonfire would require royal sanction. While many Targaryens scoffed at the notion of restricting their ancient freedom, enough recognized the value of preserving stability that the measure passed. The code was not always followed to the letter, but its existence gave the monarchy a basis to punish reckless riders within their own house. It also gave other lords a sense of empowerment, knowing there were official constraints on draconic might. Under these rules, the realm experienced a fragile but enduring harmony. The Targaryens continued to rule, their dragons soared above, and life for the small folk, though overshadowed by the monarchy's colossal power, had a certain stability lacking in more fractious kingdoms. Generations passed. Each new Targaryen monarch added a layer of complexity to the tapestry. Some were reformers, some were warmongers, some were scholars, and some were wastrels. But always, the dragons endured living flame that defined the very identity of the crown. Yet all of this was but the calm before a storm that would test the Targaryen dynasty in a way no mortal rebellion could. For in the cold wastelands beyond the wall, ancient powers stirred to life. The subtle signs had been there for centuries, but now they became undeniable. Rangers of the Night's Watch disappeared in droves, whole villages of wildlings vanished, and rumors of white, blue-eyed corpses walking in the snow reached Winterfell. Ravens sped southward, carrying pleas for aid. The Starks, ever mindful of their oath to guard the north, summoned bannermen. Lord Brandon Stark, a grim man with an unyielding sense of duty, sent word to King's Landing. The dead walked, the White Walkers had returned, and the realm must unite or face oblivion. King Aemon III Targaryen sat the Iron Throne when these tidings arrived. The name Aemon was revered among Targaryens, recalling great ancestors. This Aemon III was known to be cautious, not prone to flights of fancy. Initially, he greeted the dire reports with skepticism. The Citadel's maesters debated whether the Walking Dead were simply wildling folktales to scare Southerners into sending food or weapons. But the letters from Castle Black were consistent, growing more urgent by the day. Soon, King Aemon III could no longer dismiss them. He summoned his council, which included dragon riders, maesters, and lords paramount. A lively debate ensued over the best approach. Some suggested sending a few scouts on Dragonback to verify the threat. Others wanted to dispatch an army. A few cynics insisted it was a trick by the Starks to secure more resources. In the end, the king decided on a measured response. He would send his cousin, Prince Maegor Targaryen, and 2 other riders north on large adult dragons to see if there was truth to these tales. When Prince Maegor arrived at the wall, he found it in a state of near panic. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch took him atop the colossal ice barrier, where he peered out into a blizzard-swept wasteland. The sun was sinking, painting the horizon in bands of cold purple and fading gold. Through the swirling snow, they saw no immediate army of the dead, but the Watchers insisted that patrols had vanished. Skeptical yet uneasy, Prince Maegor mounted his dragon, a battle-scarred bronze beast called Earthbane, and flew beyond the wall. At first, he saw only endless white, a frigid desert. Then, as dusk truly fell, he glimpsed figures moving across a frozen river. Pale shapes, half gliding, half shambling, with eyes that glowed like cold flames. Earthbane roared, unleashing a torrent of fire that lit up the snowy expanse. Maegor circled down, certain that nothing alive could stand against dragonfire. But these were not living foes. Some perished in the flames, but others seemed to slip away with unnatural speed. And as Earthbane's fire melted the snow, more shapes emerged from beneath, a legion of dead men in blackened, tattered armor. This was no mere rumor. Horrified, Maegor returned to the wall. His fellow riders confirmed similar sightings. One of them spoke of a creature with pale skin and a long sword of ice that withstood dragonfire, deflecting the flame with an eerie shimmer. The riders decided to retreat south with all haste to warn the crown. They soared back across the cold sky, racing the wind. The news they bore shattered centuries of complacent rule. The White Walkers, the others, were real. They marched on the living, and even dragons might not be invincible against the chill of death. The realm reacted with shock and denial. Some lords refused to believe it, but King Aemon III, sobered by the riders' testimony, acted swiftly. He recalled the legends of the Long Night, the ancient pact with the children of the forest, and the forging of dragonglass weapons. That very moon's turn, royal decrees commanded that dragonglass be mined in massive quantities from Dragonstone and the volcanic caverns in certain coastal areas. The crown offered bounties for any blacksmith or alchemist who could incorporate obsidian into weapons. Meanwhile, Aemon III summoned the banners of the entire realm to Moat Cailin, preparing to reinforce the north. At the same time, the Targaryens recognized the critical role dragons could play. They deployed a dozen riders to the north, each with a formidable beast. The lords of Westeros had never seen so many dragons assembled in one place for war. Grand caravans of provisions headed up the King's Road, along with thousands of soldiers, marching under the sigils of Stark, Tully, Arryn, Baratheon, Tyrell, Lannister, Martell, and Greyjoy. The king himself prepared to join them on the field astride his own mount, a fierce white dragon named Winterfire. It was an unprecedented show of unity, all orchestrated by the monarchy that had long held them in thrall. Fear of the undead overcame old grudges. The threat was too dire for petty bickering. Even the faith set aside its differences with the Targaryens to hold mass prayers for the realm's salvation. For a brief moment, the absolute authority that House Targaryen wielded became a force of cohesion. None could dispute that, to survive, they needed the firepower of dragons. The first engagement with the others took place in the icy plains north of the Last Hearth. There, the combined forces of the North and the Crown's advance guard encountered a legion of wights led by tall, gaunt figures in pale armor that glimmered like frost. The Targaryen riders struck first, raining fire upon the undead ranks. Whole swathes of the whites were reduced to ash, and for a moment, it seemed victory would be swift. But then the others demonstrated their own powers. With gestures of their slender swords, they conjured swirling storms of icy wind that doused the dragonfire. Some whites fell only to rise again moments later. Earthbane, Prince Maegar's bronze dragon, was wounded by a spear of enchanted ice that seemed to form midair and strike with uncanny accuracy. Earthbane screeched and flailed, driving the others back temporarily but leaving the watchers below in dread at the realization that dragons were not an unbeatable solution. Still, the Crown's forces managed to drive the others northward, at least for a time. In the aftermath of the battle, the living realized they needed to adapt. They discovered that dragonglass, hammered into arrowheads and spear tips, proved lethal to the others themselves, shattering their icy forms. For the whites, good old-fashioned steel in combination with flame was enough, but to kill an other required obsidian or Valyrian steel. The Targaryen monarchy, with its wealth of Valyrian steel blades hoarded over centuries, outfitted its champions. Knights of the Winged Protectors swapped out their usual arms for black glittering obsidian lances. Some Targaryens who possessed ancestral Valyrian steel swords, like Darksister and others that had been forged in Old Valyria, became leading figures in the war effort. As the conflict raged, more dragons converged on the north. The sky became a tapestry of beating wings, the snow reflecting the orange glow of dragonfire. But the others learned quickly how to counter them, summoning bitter storms whenever the dragons approached in large numbers. The Targaryens found that smaller, more agile strike forces could slip through the snow squalls to deliver bursts of flame before retreating. Full-scale aerial assaults often met with swirling blizzards and deadly shards of ice hurled from the gloom. Nonetheless, the living advanced. The north was held. The Night's Watch, revitalized by southern reinforcements, guarded the wall, while the main host of Westeros hammered the undead wherever they emerged. Over time, the dragons made a telling difference. Even if the others could mitigate some of their fire, they could not be everywhere at once. The Targaryens, with centuries of refinement in breeding and riding dragons, employed cunning tactics, feints, flanking maneuvers, and synchronized flights that stretched the others' defenses. Meanwhile, ground forces used obsidian-tipped weapons to cut through the whites. The final confrontation occurred near a place the wildlings called the Fist of the First Men, an ancient ring fort perched on a high hill. A massive horde of undead, accompanied by several White Walkers, sought to circle around the main army and descend upon the forces in the rear. King Aemon III, alerted by scouts and wargriders loyal to the Starks, moved swiftly to cut them off. In a moonlit battle under an aurora shimmering in the northern sky, the Targaryens committed their greatest number of dragons yet. 15 beasts soared overhead, unleashing torrents of fire. Waves of whites were incinerated. The others conjured howling storms, cloaking the night in unnatural darkness and biting cold. But the Targaryen riders pressed on, guided by horns and signal fires. In the heart of this swirling battle, Prince Maegar, armed with a Valyrian steel spear, and Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, wielding the ancestral blade Darksister, hunted the White Walkers. Their dragons rained flame to isolate the pale figures on an icy ridge. Then, descending with breathtaking speed, they leapt from their saddles. Earthbane roared, and Rhaenyra's dragon, Silverlight, answered in kind, driving back the whites. Steel and obsidian clashed with ice. The White Walkers fought with uncanny grace, their blades crackling with cold that could shatter common steel. But Valyrian steel was no common metal. With a fierce thrust, Prince Maegar impaled one of the others, which exploded into shards of frozen light. Princess Rhaenyra slashed through another, dispatching it with a swirl of black cloak and silver hair. By the time dawn broke, the living stood victorious atop the Fist of the First Men. The undead forces had shattered, receding back into the endless white. Whether they were utterly destroyed or only scattered was unknown. The others themselves seemed to melt away, leaving behind no trace but the corpses of whites that collapsed without the animating magic. The war was won for the moment. The long night had not fully descended thanks, in large part, to the unwavering might of House Targaryen and its dragons. When news of the victory spread, celebrations erupted across Westeros. The Targaryens were hailed as true protectors of the realm, fulfilling a destiny that some said had been foretold for centuries. Even lords who resented their overlordship had to acknowledge that without dragons, the North might have fallen. The monarchy, for its part, took pains to thank every region that contributed forces, ensuring that the glory was shared. King Aemon III declared a new holiday, the Day of Fire and Dawn, to commemorate the alliance of men and dragon that had kept the cold darkness at bay. In the months that followed, efforts continued to clear out scattered pockets of whites north of the Wall. A few Targaryen riders and loyal knights ventured into the land of always winter, seeking to ensure no new army of the dead might reform. Still, the others seemed to have vanished. Some speculated they had been utterly destroyed, while others believed they only slumbered, waiting for another era of weakness. In the aftermath, the Targaryens enjoyed a renewed surge of goodwill. Then the small folk who once muttered about draconic tyranny found themselves grateful for the royal brood that had turned a potential cataclysm into a triumphant victory. The monarchy seized the moment to strengthen ties with noble houses, forging fresh marriages, awarding new titles to heroes of the war, and granting land in the north to those who had displayed exceptional valor. The king's hand oversaw projects to improve roads and fortify strategic points, especially near the neck and along the White Knife. The centuries-old question of northern independence was largely tabled, for even the proudest Stark recognized the undeniable value the crown had brought in that dire hour. Yet with peace secured, old patterns began to reassert themselves. Over time, some Targaryens returned to indulging in their luxuries and internal intrigues. The memory of the undead threat slowly faded in the minds of those who had not witnessed it firsthand. But the monarchy at least had proven it had a purpose beyond mere power. It served as the shield of the realm against threats unimaginable. The decades rolled on. House Targaryen continued to thrive, with the bloodline branching further, the dragons passing from one generation to the next. The monarchy's absolute dominion was tempered by a renewed sense of responsibility. Historians looking back on this alternate course marveled at how drastically the survival of dragons had shaped Westeros. Gone were the great rebellions that might have shattered the realm. Gone was the notion that any single house could rise up and claim the throne by force. Instead, House Targaryen remained the apex, unchallenged except by the realm's own internal struggles and occasional conspiracies. In the courts of Pentos, Bravos, Lys, and beyond, the Targaryens were regarded with a mixture of fascination and dread. The might of Valyria, once thought lost in the Doom, lived on in these silver-haired kings and queens. Envoys from Essos arrived in King's Landing with lavish gifts, hoping to secure favorable trade deals. Occasionally, an alliance was struck, or a Targaryen prince would take an Essosi bride. Meanwhile, the monarchy's vigilance extended to ensuring that no power in the free cities experimented with the arcane secrets of dragon taming or the forging of new wonders. The Targaryens considered themselves the guardians of such knowledge, believing that too many dragon lords might usher in a second doom. As centuries further passed, the spectacle of dragons in flight became woven into daily life in King's Landing and Dragonstone. Whenever a new Targaryen heir was presented to the people, a flight of dragons would soar over the city, trailing smoke and flame in a display reminiscent of the lost wonders of Valyria. The small folk would cheer, children gaping in awe, though a subtle undercurrent of fear always lingered. In the countryside, farmers learned to watch the sky for silhouettes, just in case a young dragon was out hunting. Entire craft guilds were devoted to forging dragon-sized chains, bridles, and armor plating. The realm's architecture changed to accommodate the presence of dragons. Moats were made wider, gates taller, and special roosting towers dotted the capitals of lords who were closely tied to the Targaryens. Yet not all Targaryens lived in King's Landing. Many took to wandering, exploring the far reaches of the continent on dragonback. Some ventured into the Sunset Sea, or soared over the shivering sea to see if they could reach far-flung lands. Most found only open water or endless tundra. A few claimed to have glimpsed new continents or islands teeming with strange creatures, but those tales remain unverified by the maesters. Indeed, the maesters themselves had a complicated relationship with the monarchy. They served the realm, but the Targaryens' secrecy regarding draconic lore sometimes rankled them. In time, certain archmaesters gained permission to study the dragons up close, measuring wingspans, cataloging scale colorations, analyzing growth patterns. These studies enriched the understanding of dragon biology, ensuring that the species thrived. Yet the Targaryens guarded the deeper secrets. Knowledge gleaned from the remnants of Valyria about bonding with dragons, about forging the unique relationship that allowed a rider to command a beast capable of laying waste to entire armies. They believed that so long as they alone possessed this knowledge, the realm would remain stable under their rule. In the grand sweep of time, House Targaryen's unbroken chain of dragon riders shaped every facet of Westerosi culture. Bards sang of the gilded wings that had shielded the realm from the long night's return. The faith, once so opposed to Targaryen incestuous traditions, eventually adopted an accommodating stance, rationalizing that the Targaryens were chosen by the Seven to protect the land. The High Septon's seat in Old Town was adorned with murals depicting a stylized alliance of the Seven's figures and the three-headed dragon. Great houses jostled not for independence but for greater favor and the chance that one of their scions might be given a dragon's egg as a mark of distinction. There were, of course, Targaryens who abused their power, using dragons to intimidate or meddle in the affairs of lesser lords for personal gain. Such incidents sparked outrage, sometimes leading to councils that curbed the monarchy's prerogatives. But no matter the ebb and flow of politics, the bedrock of Targaryen rule remained unshaken. A heritage of living flame that soared above the Seven Kingdoms, casting both a protective light and a fearful shadow across the land. And so, as the world turned, as alliances rose and fell, as new songs were composed and old stories faded into memory, the Targaryens stood at the pinnacle. Their dragons never died out. Their legacy never crumbled into dust. For better or worse, they had shaped Westeros into a realm defined by the presence of these majestic, terrifying creatures. Peace was enforced by flame, war was tempered by the knowledge of mutual destruction, and the monarchy's power was as vast as the wings that spread across the sky. Even in times of strife, when the Iron Throne's occupant was challenged by a cousin or a distant branch of the family, the dance never became the all-consuming inferno it might have been. Too many dragons existed, too many lines of kinship, and too many lords who relied on the Targaryen dynasty for stability. Instead, heated arguments and fleeting skirmishes usually ended in negotiation. If the Targaryens had one unspoken credo, it was this: never risk the annihilation of our greatest strength. They had learned from the cautionary tales of Valyria, from the near catastrophes of civil wars that threatened their brood. They might fight among themselves, but not to the last dragon. Now and then, a stifled voice would lament that Westeros might have been better off without dragons, that the land was under the perpetual heel of a single family's might. But rarely did such voices gather momentum, for fear of the crown's retribution. And some argued that the realm's relative peace, its swift victory over the northern horrors, and its unity in the face of external threats were worth the yoke of Targaryen supremacy. In old age, King Aemon III Targaryen, the very one who rallied the dragons to defeat the undead, would sometimes reflect on the legacy he was leaving behind. In a private letter to his daughter, Princess Daenerys, he wrote of his mixed feelings: pride in the power that House Targaryen wielded and sorrow for those who chafed under it. The dragons are our blessing, he wrote, and our burden. They have given us the might to shape the world, but we must also carry the weight of that responsibility, lest we become as monstrous as the fires we command. His sentiment captured the fundamental tension at the heart of Targaryen rule in a world where they never lost their dragons. They were gods of the sky, unbound by normal checks on power, yet they remained men and women prone to folly, ambition, and love. They could make mistakes, and those mistakes had consequences measured in scorched cities or entire armies turned to ash. But as each generation passed, the Targaryens found a way to endure, forging an empire that balanced on the razor's edge of flame and fear, unity and tyranny. By the close of the 5th century after Aegon's landing, the tapestry of Westeros was a rich, complex mosaic. The crown boasted nearly 40 living dragons of various ages and sizes, maintained in carefully tended roosts and lairs. House Targaryen itself was an intricate family tree, with lines fanning out into many regions, linking the monarchy to the Starks, the Lannisters, the Baratheons, the Martells, and beyond. The roads were safer than in many realms, for brigands feared the wrath of the Crown's roving dragon riders. Coastal raids by Ironborn were less frequent, deterred by the knowledge that a single pass of draconic flame could annihilate their longships. Trade flowed, wealth grew, and the small folk lived under a stable if sometimes heavy-handed regime. The conflicts that did arise took new forms: clashes of intrigue at court, economic rivalries, or subtle attempts by certain houses to wrest concessions from the monarchy without provoking outright war. Meanwhile, the Targaryens continued to sponsor scholarship, encouraging maesters and learned men to delve deeper into the arcane arts, though always under the Crown's watchful eye. They did not wish to repeat the downfall of Valyria, so they outlawed the practice of certain blood sorceries. But what knowledge they possessed of dragon lore and Valyrian steel forging, they guarded jealously, sharing only enough to maintain the realm's needs. It might be said that, in this reality, Westeros traded the freedom of uncertain fiefdoms and occasional rebellions for the certainty of Targaryen rule. Had the dragons died out, the realm might have splintered, kingdoms might have warred, dynasties might have risen and fallen. Perhaps a new conqueror or a new house would have emerged. But the flame of House Targaryen never flickered, never died, and so Westeros became a land under one banner, where the threat of fire from above quelled the ambitions of lesser rulers. For some, it was a paradise of peace. For others, a prison of fear. Still, the Targaryens were not entirely unchallenged by fate. Nature itself sometimes struck at them. Droughts, storms, and plagues that even dragons could not burn away. The monarchy wrestled with these calamities, deploying riders to deliver supplies, sometimes incinerating plague pits with dragonfire. Such dramatic gestures helped maintain the notion that the Targaryens were beneficent protectors. Yet every crisis tested the monarchy's ability to coordinate relief and quell unrest. Over time, these repeated trials refined the Crown's bureaucracy, forging a more efficient administration that took advantage of the swift travel dragon riders provided. Where a normal messenger might take weeks to deliver urgent news, a dragon rider could arrive in days or less. Then there were the personal dramas, tragic love stories, bitter rivalries, exiled princes, secret bastards who claimed a fraction of Targaryen blood and sought a dragon of their own. The royal line had its share of scandal. Sometimes a child of uncertain parentage would attempt to bond with a hatchling, only to be burned or devoured. Other times, a Targaryen who felt overlooked in the line of succession might steal away with a dragon and vanish into the far corners of the world, only to reappear years later with new allies or new secrets. Yet these episodes, while stirring rumor and fear, never erupted into a cataclysmic civil war. The monarchy had grown adept at containing crises before they shattered the realm. By the time 6 centuries had passed since Aegon's landing, many in Westeros could not imagine a world without Targaryens in the sky. The silhouette of a dragon overhead no longer automatically triggered terror, though it never ceased to inspire awe. The monarchies might remain unassailable, for no single faction could muster enough scorpions or magic or cunning to slay so many dragons and dethrone so many Targaryens. Indeed, some in the monarchy boasted that they had achieved what even the Valyrian freehold could not. They had ruled without fracturing into countless dragonlord families, without letting ambition lead to mutual destruction, without letting the secrets of dragon breeding slip from their hands. They had, in essence, perfected the concept of draconic governance. And yet, beneath the layers of grandeur, the fundamental question lingered. Had Westeros lost something intangible by living under a single dynasty's rule for centuries on end? The small folk seldom chose their own destinies in the feudal system, but the presence of dragons made challenging the monarchy a near impossibility. If the Targaryens were benevolent or at least not wholly malevolent, could that be called a success? Or was it a gilded cage from which the realm could never escape? Such philosophical questions were debated in hushed tones by maesters and septons, by traveling mummers who performed subtle allegories in their plays, and by lords who wondered if the Targaryen stranglehold was worth the peace it purchased. None could deny that the others had been defeated. None could deny that bandits, pirates, and invaders stood little chance against Dragonfire. None could deny that roads were safer, trade more abundant, and large-scale wars all but extinct in Westeros. Yet the price was subservience to a single dynasty's will, generation after generation. Perhaps the Targaryens themselves sometimes felt that weight, for it was said that on quiet nights, a Targaryen king or queen might walk alone through the silent halls of the Red Keep, hearing the distant roars of dragons echo in the sky. They would look out from the battlements, see the sprawling city below, and wonder if they were truly the masters of their domain or just caretakers of a power that could destroy them all if misused. For all their pride, the Targaryens knew that the dragons, in the end, were not mere beasts of burden. They were living, breathing incarnations of fire and fury, as much a force of nature as any storm or earthquake. And forces of nature could be guided, but never fully tamed. So it was that the Targaryens reigned, for centuries upon centuries, with dragons as their steadfast companions and living weapons. So it was that Westeros became a unified continent under a single monarchy, its many dialects, customs, and local loyalties subsumed under the overarching banner of the three-headed dragon. So it was that the long night was averted by the scorching flame of an unbroken line of dragon riders. And so it might continue, so long as the Targaryens remembered the lesson that had haunted Valyria's doom, that absolute power demands absolute vigilance, for even a single misstep can plunge the world into chaos. In this alternate Westeros, where the dragons never died out, the story of House Targaryen remains a grand tapestry of triumph and tension, of unwavering might and the perpetual risk that such might could consume them all. Through it all, the dragons fly, majestic, terrible, eternal, above fields of green and seas of blue, above towering mountains and windswept plains, above kings and queens, lords and ladies, small folk and knights, reminding every soul that the power of House Targaryen is woven into the very heavens. And so they endure generation upon generation, in the living legacy of fire made flesh, the keepers of a realm that might otherwise have fallen to shadow, but now lives ever in the fierce and unrelenting light of Dragonfire. From the high window of the Red Keep's tallest tower, the city spread out in 1,000 flickers of light below, and the darkness beyond the walls seemed almost to meld with the sea. King Aemon III Targaryen had once stood at a similar vantage in his youth, viewing King's Landing by night, marveling that a single family's decisions could determine the fate of so many souls. The older he grew, the more aware he became that the dragons, for all their might, would not quell every trouble in Westeros. Their presence had held the realm together, bound it in awe and fear both, but if the Targaryens were careless, they might one day become the architects of their own ruin. In the aftermath of the Great Northern War against the White Walkers, the realm had seen decades of relative peace. The entire kingdom had welcomed the return of summer, regarding it as a deliverance from cosmic threat. North of the Wall, the Night's Watch still patrolled, reinforcing old forts they had once abandoned. Far to the south, in Dorne, travelers noted that fewer desert raids troubled the Dornish marches. Lords from the Reach and the Stormlands exchanged letters about new trade routes, while the Lannisters in the west experimented with deeper mining tunnels beneath Casterly Rock. Everywhere, people spoke of an era of plenty. And yet, old instincts told the king, and other thoughtful Targaryens, that trouble never vanished completely. It merely changed its shape. King Aemon III's hair, long and silver, flowed down the back of his doublet, which bore the three-headed dragon in shimmering black thread. He turned from the window, letting the night envelop the city, and made his way down the winding staircase to the chambers where his council waited. At the same time, up in the swirling skies, a pair of young dragons passed overhead. Their shadows rippled across the cobbled streets below, as though the city itself held its breath in an ancient reflex of awe. Only a few children craned their necks to see them pass. Dragons had become a commonplace sight in King's Landing, yet each glimpse was still enough to remind the small folk that they lived in a realm shaped by flame. In the council room, Prince Maegor, older now with a thread of gray at his temples, rose from his seat as his cousin, the king, entered. Others gathered there included lords and ladies of high houses, several Targaryens of more distant branches, and a handful of loyal knights. Maegor and Aemon had faced the other side by side at the Fist of the First Men, but the years since had worn away some illusions of brotherly closeness. Maegor had a certain hunger for deeds that would go down in the annals of history, and rumor claimed he looked for new foes to conquer, new ways to prove the Targaryen line's dominion. "The messenger from Old Town arrived at dawn," Maegor said without preamble, gesturing for a scroll on the table. "They request your counsel. A Shadowbinder from Ashai has come claiming to foresee doom upon the waves. The High Septon is gravely concerned." "Doom upon the waves?" The king took the scroll and scanned it, his eyes narrowing at the melodramatic phrases. "Yes, I see. A storm that might swallow the fleet. A monstrous shape in the deeps. The Shadowbinder wants coin for more precise warnings." A cousin from a younger line, a plump Targaryen lady named Baela, gave a delicate snort. "Another trickster, I'd wager. We've all heard these claims from the east. They speak of drowned gods and watery beasts to frighten those who'll pay for glimpses of the future. The Citadel exposed countless such frauds over the centuries." Aemon set the scroll aside. "We'll send a royal observer to Old Town to speak with both the High Septon and the Shadowbinder. No grand alarm, but no outright dismissal. We have learned not to ignore warnings out of hand." He glanced at Maegor, recalling the days when the White Walkers were but distant rumors. "Still, it's likely a ruse." Maegor, arms folded, nodded once. "I'll find a suitable boy, perhaps one of our less warlike kin who has an interest in matters of prophecy." That was that. The meeting turned to other business. Taxes from the Vale, negotiations with bravos about interest rates, a small outcry in the Crownlands where a restless young dragon had burnt a fishing village's nets. For each matter, a solution was proposed, tested, accepted. The monotony of governance wore on until, near midnight, the king dismissed the council. He rose with a weary sigh, parted ways with his cousin, and retreated to his private apartments. The next morning brought a crispness to the autumn air, though it was not yet cold. King's Landing streets bustled at dawn. Vendors rolled out carts, and the smell of fresh bread and fish stew mingled with the stench of the city's waste. Gold cloaks patrolled, puffing themselves up to impress passers-by. Over by Rhaenys' hill, the dragon pit stood, a massive dome built to house some of the realm's adult dragons. One by one, stable hands and dragon tenders checked on the great beasts within, ensuring they were fed. The Targaryens prized these caretakers, for a starving dragon could cause chaos. The last thing the crown wanted was for a hungry drake to wander off into the city in search of food. Inside the dragon pit, sunlight slanted through high apertures, illuminating the swirling dust in the air. 3 adult dragons prowled the cavernous interior. One was a sable-scaled female called Darkdalon, known for her ferocity. Another was a gold and green male named Brasswing. The third was a younger male, only recently deemed large enough to roam freely, his scales mottled red and silver. He answered to no rider yet, a subject of some debate, for every young Targaryen of suitable age vied to prove themselves worthy of bonding with him. This particular morning, a small group of Targaryen princes and princesses stood at a safe distance from the dragons, each trying to muster the courage to approach the red and silver beast. The prince who had the backing of his father, Lord Aeron Targaryen of a minor cadet branch, stepped forward first, armed with raw goat meat. He inched nearer, calling out softly in the old Valyrian phrases taught to would-be dragon riders. The beast eyed him, tail lashing against the floor, stirring up clouds of dust. When the prince extended the goat meat, the dragon let out a short, testing growl. No one spoke, but tension buzzed among the watchers. If the dragon accepted the offering, the prince might succeed in forging the first bonds that would grow over months or years into a rider's command. If the dragon rejected him, or worse, if it felt threatened, this day would become another grim cautionary tale. The watchers remembered well that not all Targaryens, not even those with the blood of the dragon, were guaranteed success. The prince got within a dozen paces before the dragon hissed, a spurt of flame escaping its jaws. The prince dropped the meat, jumped back, and nearly fell on his backside in his scramble to escape. that set off a chorus of quiet laughter from onlookers and a bellow from a Targaryen matriarch who scolded the watchers for encouraging recklessness. Embarrassed, the prince tried again, but the dragon hissed louder. A caretaker intervened, gently guiding the prince away. "Another day," the caretaker said. "Let him sense your presence more often first." Watching this small drama unfold was a young woman of about 17, her hair bound in a simple braid. Princess Naerys Targaryen had come without fanfare, intrigued to see how the bonding rituals proceeded. She carried no goat meat, wore no fancy armor, and seemed content to remain on the sidelines. As she watched the thwarted attempts, her curiosity grew. The red and silver dragon had an alert, intelligent gaze, clearly no docile creature to be bought with raw meat. Perhaps, she thought, it yearned for something else, like a rider whose confidence ran deeper than a superficial display. A caretaker noticed her. "Princess, would you care to try? Or shall I send for a guard to escort you back?" Naerys tilted her head in thought, then shook it. "No, I'll leave him be for now," she said softly. "I'll come again, perhaps another day, if he's in a kinder mood." She cast one more glance at the restless drake. There was something in his eyes, neither malice nor indifference, but a challenge. That same morning, out in the courtyard of the Red Keep, Prince Maegor readied himself to depart for Dragonstone. He intended to check on the hatcheries and speak with the keepers about a rumored clutch of eggs that might be nearing hatching. Even after all these centuries, the Targaryens spared no expense in ensuring the future generations of dragons. When a new clutch was expected, the crown often dispatched a ranking family member to oversee the process, treat the keepers with due respect, and see that no sabotage threatened the eggs. Memories of the Ashen Flame conspiracy, long ago, still lingered. Maegor mounted his own dragon, Earthbane, older now, bearing scars from the Northern War. Caretakers had strapped fresh supplies and gear to the saddle. The day was mild, the breezes from Blackwater Bay cool on the face, and with a roar that shook the castle walls, Earthbane launched into the air. Soldiers on the battlements gazed up in admiration and fear, for Earthbane was known to have a temper. Maegor circled once over the city, scanning the busy harbor with its forest of masts, then angled the dragon's flight toward the open sea. By mid-morning, the silhouette of Earthbane had vanished from King's Landing, leaving only the distant echo of wing beats. Back in the city, life continued. Merchants haggled in the fish market, noble families prepared for feasts, and the Red Keep's corridors bustled with servants ferrying wine and bread to the royal kitchens. On the street of steel, blacksmiths shaped swords and armor, many forging arrowheads or spear tips from dragonglass, just in case the realm should ever again need such weapons. Although the White Walkers seemed gone for good, no Targaryen king dared let the skill of working obsidian fall into neglect. Elsewhere, at the Great September, septas led pious worshippers in prayer, reminding them that the seven watched over the realm with divine grace. The Targaryens, some septas said in carefully measured language, were chosen by the gods to guide and protect them all. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, quiet tensions ran through the realm. On Dragonstone, Maegor landed with a thunderous impact in the courtyard. Soldiers snapped to attention. Servants hurried to gather Earthbane's tack and feed the beast. Maegor dismounted with practiced ease. He was met by the Castellan, Ser Tristan Celtigar, who bowed and gave his lord a respectful welcome. "The eggs you came to see are in the lower caverns, Prince," said Ser Tristan. "We've increased the guards, as you ordered. No sign of trouble, but we're taking no chances." Maegor nodded. "Show me." As they descended, the heat intensified, for the Targaryens often kept large braziers burning near the eggs to replicate a dragon's natural warmth. The passages beneath Dragonstone were labyrinthine, carved from volcanic rock. Crystals of obsidian glittered in the walls, reflecting the flames of the torches. In a reinforced chamber stood half a dozen eggs, resting on beds of smoldering coals. Each shell glimmered in unique patterns, some black as midnight, others pale with streaks of gold or green. Maegor paused before them, letting his eyes drift over their ridged contours. "How long until they hatch?" he asked, voice hushed. Ser Tristan consulted a parchment. Likely within a month, perhaps less. They exhibit the telltale heat and trembling, though none have begun to crack. The keepers watch them day and night. Maegor crouched to examine one particular egg, a large one with swirling bronze flecks. A pang of memory surfaced. That coloring reminded him faintly of Earthbane's own egg, decades ago. "We'll station 2 more guards in this corridor," he said, "and double the patrols at night. I won't have any risk of meddling. Let the keepers know I'll hold them personally accountable for these hatchlings' safety." Ser Tristan nodded, though a flicker of unease showed on his face. Everyone remembered the Ashen Flame. "Yes, Prince," he said, adjusting his grip on the parchment. "I'll see to it." After a final inspection, Maegor straightened. His gaze lingered on the eggs, as if searching for omens in their patterns. "One day, these creatures will be older than we are now," he mused, half to himself. "They might serve riders not yet born, in wars not yet fought." "Let us hope the wars are few," said Ser Tristan carefully. "We've seen enough strife in our time." Maegor gave a non-committal grunt, then turned and made his way back up the winding stairs. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, in the city of Pentos, envoys from the Targaryen court negotiated trade treaties. Tall masts soared above the harbor, and the marble towers gleamed in the midday sun. The Pentoshi magisters eyed the Targaryen heraldry with a mix of caution and greed. They knew that a single Targaryen rider and dragon could incinerate half their fleet, but they also recognized that forging closer ties might be lucrative. The Targaryens had never sought to conquer Pentos by force, partly because it was simpler to allow these eastern cities some independence as long as they respected the crown's shipping lanes and refrained from meddling in Westeros. At a lavish banquet in the Hall of 1,000 Lanterns, ambassadors from King's Landing pledged to keep the shipping routes to the Stepstones open in exchange for favorable grain prices. The Pentoshi magisters feigned mild offense. Grain was in high demand, after all, but eventually conceded to new terms. They had little choice. That same night, a Targaryen princess, Aelora Targaryen, who was cousin to King Aemon III, gave a demonstration of draconic might. Her mount, a lean green female named Moondancer, performed a slow, circling flight above the harbor, sending shadows skittering across the water. Every fisherman and tradesman in Pentos looked up nervously. The message was clear: best not antagonize the house that commands dragons. Yet Aelora was also there to collect information. Rumors swirled through the free cities that Volantis was once again itching for expansion. The Triarchs had built up their fleets, some said, and they employed sellsword companies of dubious reputation. A few whispered that certain mages in Volantis sought fragments of old Valyrian lore to breed or control lesser draconic creatures, wyverns or rumored half-formed beasts from Sithorios. Most maesters back in Westeros dismissed such claims as outlandish. Still, the Targaryens kept an ear to the ground. They knew from bitter experience how knowledge and cunning could pose a threat equal to steel. Aelora gleaned that Volantis had indeed been making covert overtures to Lys and Meer, hinting at a grand alliance. Precisely what they hoped to accomplish remained murky. The Targaryens, for their part, had no interest in waging a war across the sea, unless forced to. But if Volantis tested their patience, the crown might dispatch 6 dragons to burn their harbor in a single swoop. For now, though, diplomacy seemed sufficient. A few carefully planted rumors of Targaryen vigilance, plus the veiled reminder that the monarchy had more dragons at its command than any force in the known world, tended to cool most expansions. That was the nature of Targaryen rule in these centuries, maintaining a precarious balance of power, outwardly unassailable, but always watchful for cunning that might slip beneath their guard. They might have built 1,000 scorpions in Volantis, or employed Shadowbinders from Ass High, or tried to replicate old Valyrian rituals. The Targaryens were determined never to let themselves be outmaneuvered by arrogance. Back in King's Landing, Princess Naerys Targaryen paid another visit to the dragon pit. Days had passed since she'd observed the red and silver dragon spurn that unfortunate prince. This time, she came alone except for a single sworn shield. The keepers recognized her. They warned that the drake was restless again, though it had been fed, and suggested she keep her distance if she valued her safety. Naerys studied the dragon from across the expanse. Sunlight cut angled beams through the high windows, glinting off the drake's scales, giving them a metallic sheen. The dragon shifted on its haunches, turning a watchful golden eye upon her. She felt a prickle run down her spine. For a moment, she recalled the old tales. How Valyrians had first learned to bind dragons to their will through blood and magic. How many had perished in those attempts. How the Targaryens alone had escaped the doom to bring that knowledge west. Slowly, quietly, she stepped forward. Her sworn shield made as if to follow, but she held up a hand. "Wait here," she said. For a few heartbeats, the only sounds were the soft scuff of her boots and the dragon's rhythmic breathing. She could see faint wisps of smoke curling from its nostrils. If it sensed fear, it might lash out. So she drew in a slow breath of her own. She had no raw meat to offer, only herself and the intangible sense of calm she tried to project. "Easy," Naerys said in a low voice, using the old Valyrian phrases she had been taught. "I am Naerys, blood of the dragon. I come in peace." It sounded trite, even to her ears, but the incantations from ancient texts were said to help. She eased another step closer, her eyes never leaving the drake's. The dragon hissed, but it was a lower, more thoughtful sound than outright aggression. The end of its tail flicked across the floor, raising dust motes. Naerys paused, her heart thudding. She could feel the heat radiating from the creature's body. Another second passed. Her gaze flicked to the drake's chest, where the red scales were interlaced with silver streaks that shone like hammered steel. It was as if the dragon wore a living coat of arms. She stretched out a tentative hand. Not close enough to touch, but close enough for the dragon to sniff the air around her. The drake's pupils narrowed, fixating on her. A deep rumble came from its throat. The keepers tensed, ready to intervene if it attacked. But it did not spring forward. Naerys exhaled, her breath trembling, and took one last step. Now she could almost touch the dragon's flank if she dared. In that moment, she felt something shift between them. A subtle stirring of awareness, as though the dragon recognized a spark of kinship. The drake lowered its head, nostrils flaring. She remembered a piece of raw goat meat might have helped, but something told her that if this dragon required mere food for trust, it was not the companion she believed it could be. So she stood there, unarmed, heart pounding, letting the dragon decide. Then, in a quiet acceptance, the drake lifted its head and let out a short, sharp exhalation that grazed her hair with hot breath. The keepers blinked. One whispered, "Seven save us." She might actually bond with him. Naerys did not dare move closer unbidden, but she held her ground. Her own Targaryen blood sang in her veins, a mixture of awe and elation at standing so close to living flame without being scorched. The dragon's tail swished again, more languid this time, as though acknowledging her presence. She stayed until her legs ached, ignoring the watchful stares of the keepers, letting the moment stretch until the dragon finally turned away. That seemed enough for one day, and it was more than enough to spark rumor and speculation in the dragon pit. News spread quickly through the Red Keep. Princess Naerys Targaryen had made friendly contact with the new drake, the same dragon that had scorched any who approached too boldly. Her father, King Aemon III, when he heard, merely nodded and said, "If it is meant to be, let her proceed, but keep a close eye." He remembered well how bonding rituals could go awry. Many Targaryens had tried to claim dragons, only to earn nasty burns or even lose their lives. Yet if the beast did accept Naerys, it would be an auspicious omen for the realm. A new rider with a formidable mount often brought renewed prestige or unexpected ambition. Thus began the cautious dance between Naerys and the red and silver dragon. Over the following weeks, she visited regularly, offering not just meat but also a calm presence. She avoided sudden movements, spoke in gentle tones of Valyrian. Each time, the drake allowed her to come a little nearer. Eventually, she managed to lay a hand on its flank, feeling the rippling muscles beneath the warm scales. By then, the keepers were calling the dragon Ashfire, a name they had borrowed from an old legend about a spirit of flame dwelling in the mountains near Old Valyria. Naerys took a liking to the name. In time, she started calling the beast, my friend. Ashfire, for his part, endured the attention with a measured curiosity that hinted at acceptance. Not long after, she attempted a first flight. The keepers warned her that a dragon and used to a rider might throw her off. But Naerys had practiced the motions on gentler dragons, guided by older Targaryens. On a crisp morning, with the dragon pit's wide doors swung open to let in the sun, she climbed carefully onto Ashfire's back. The moment felt surreal. Smoke curled around her. Hot scales pressed her legs, and she sensed the coiled power in the drake's body. A hush fell across the watchers as she gave a gentle nudge. For a moment, Ashfire seemed uncertain. Then, with a bellowing roar, he launched himself forward, half galloping, half flying as he barreled out of the pit. The gust of air knocked one unlucky keeper off his feet. The watchers gasped and scattered. In the open sky, Naerys clung to the saddle. The world dropped away beneath her, the city shrinking to a quilt of rooftops and winding streets. Ashfire's wings beat with rhythmic force, carrying them higher. For a terrifying heartbeat, she feared losing her grip, feared that the dragon might fling her off to plummet to her doom. But Ashfire did not. He soared in a tightening spiral over King's Landing, exhaling short bursts of flame that flashed orange against the bright sky. The wind whipped Naerys' hair loose from its braid. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it over the rush of the air. Below, thousands of King's Landing residents looked up, shading their eyes. A new rider had taken flight. Some cheered, thinking it a spectacle. Others cowered indoors, still uneasy about dragons so close to their homes. In the Red Keep, King Aemon III stepped out onto a balcony, his expression a mixture of pride and apprehension. She was so young, yet she was Targaryen. Ashfire did not fly for long that first time, nor did Naerys push him. After a few wide arcs above the city and a pass over the Blackwater Bay, they returned to the dragon pit. She dismounted on unsteady legs, numb with adrenaline. The watchers rushed to see if she was unhurt, but a grin tugged at her lips. "I'm fine," she murmured, voice shaking only slightly. "He's magnificent." Word of her successful bonding spread fast. Lords and ladies at court whispered that Princess Naerys might prove a significant figure in the Targaryen succession. Though she was not the king's oldest child, dragon riders often carried an aura that placed them high in the realm's esteem. Some suggested that if King Aemon III's older heirs proved lackluster, the realm might gravitate toward Naerys. The Targaryens had an old adage, "The dragon chooses," implying that fate was woven into these bondings. Whether or not that was political nonsense, it meant the princess now had a certain gravitas in the eyes of the aristocracy. Meanwhile, far to the west, House Lannister dealt with troubles of its own. Casterly Rock, perched high above the Sunset Sea, had seen a series of tunnel collapses in its gold mines. Though none were especially severe, a pattern emerged that worried Lord Tybalt Lannister. He suspected sabotage. But who would sabotage a Lannister mine? The nearest houses were sworn to him. The Targaryens had no interest in collapsing tunnels, and bandits had nothing to gain from buried gold. Tybalt wrote to King's Landing, requesting an investigation. The crown dispatched a party of gold cloaks and a few Targaryen envoys who specialized in arbitrating feuds. When they arrived, they found no immediate evidence of sabotage. Only rumors that strange men had been seen near the mines at night, chanting or painting odd symbols on the rock. The Lannister guards had found traces of black wax and ashy residue. A sorcerer's prank? Or the beginnings of a new conspiracy? The crown's envoys shrugged off the idea that anyone from across the sea would bother with the Lannister mines, but they dutifully arranged for a double watch. Work continued, gold was extracted, and for a time the collapses ceased. But unsettling tales spread among the miners. Glimpses of pale figures who vanished into the darkness, unnatural winds blowing through the depths, even apparitions of a monstrous shadow with an elongated skull. Few believed these claims, yet a kernel of unease lodged in the minds of the investigators. Centuries of living under Targaryen rule had taught Westeros that the world still held old magics and old horrors beyond rational explanation. Back in King's Landing, Princess Naerys grew more comfortable with flight, taking Ashfire out each dawn to patrol the skies near the Blackwater. She found that the dragon's temperament was neither gentle nor vicious. Rather, he was willful, prone to testing her boundaries. She learned to respond calmly yet firmly. If she flinched at his roars, he would push harder next time. If she met him with quiet confidence, he would settle. Their early flights were short, but soon she took him farther, gliding over the forests of the Crownlands, letting him dip low in search of deer. She maintained discipline, ensuring that the dragon did not scorch farmland or terrify peasants more than necessary. News of her aerial journeys reached the Red Keep's servants, who began calling her Naerys the Bold. Not everyone approved of her growing renown. One of her older cousins, Prince Varon Targaryen, had long yearned for a dragon of his own but never succeeded in bonding. He had tried with 2 hatchlings, both of which spurned him. Now, seeing his younger relative stride through the castle halls in flight leathers, hair singed at the tips from dragonfire, rankled his pride. It did not help that some courtiers whispered she might surpass him in the line of inheritance. Varon seethed in private, confiding in a circle of sycophants who flattered his grievances. There had always been rivalries within the Targaryen family, petty feuds that occasionally flared into dangerous conflicts. King Aemon III's vigilance usually kept the peace, but envy could smolder for years before igniting. For her part, Naerys remained unaware or dismissive of Varon's resentment. She dedicated her days to practicing flight maneuvers, studying old texts on dragon lore, and assisting the realm's master of ships in scouting for pirates along the coast. On the occasional flight out to the Stepstones, she'd patrol the shipping lanes, ensuring no reemergence of pirate strongholds. The small folk in coastal villages came to associate her draconic silhouette with a sense of protection. The new princess rider, they said, was keen on safeguarding the realm, not just basking in the power her mount provided. Meanwhile, Prince Maegor completed his inspection of the eggs on Dragonstone. 4 of the 6 eventually hatched. 2 died in the shell, unfortunate but not uncommon. The survivors were healthy, squealing hatchlings no bigger than a large hound. Maegor's presence had smoothed operations. The keepers felt reassured by his oversight. After ensuring the hatchlings were well cared for, he took Earthbane back to King's Landing. On arrival, he heard the news that his niece Naerys had bonded with Ashfire. He observed the hush that fell when her name came up, the respectful tilt of heads. Even those who outranked her in birth order seemed to sense that a new rider with a fearsome dragon commanded a special status. Maegor decided to test her. He approached her in the courtyard one afternoon, while she was conversing with keepers about some minor scuffle Ashfire had with another dragon in the dragon pit. She turned as Maegor strode over, flanked by 2 knights. His presence carried its own intimidation. He was not a large man, but his face bore the austere lines of someone who had faced supernatural horrors and survived. "Naerys," he said, inclining his head a fraction. "Congratulations on your success with Ashfire. The realm can always use another strong rider." She dipped into a polite curtsy. "Thank you, uncle. I'm thankful he accepted me." Maegor clasped his hands behind his back. "I wonder if you'd join me for a short flight tomorrow. Show me what you and Ashfire can do." His tone was measured, but his eyes glimmered with curiosity. "Earthbane and I will accompany you to the Crownlands border. A demonstration, let us say." Naerys read his intention. A test, indeed. Maegor wanted to see how well she controlled her dragon. If she faltered, he would know her bond was fragile. She nodded without hesitation. "We'd be honored." At sunrise the next day, they met at a field outside the city walls. The sky was clear, the wind light. Earthbane, older and bulkier, dwarfed Ashfire in both size and wingspan. Guards and onlookers kept a wary distance. Maegor climbed onto Earthbane's saddle with practiced ease, and Naerys followed suit on Ashfire. She whispered a soothing greeting, felt the ripple of tension beneath the dragon's scales. She knew Ashfire sometimes grew agitated around larger dragons, a vestige of establishing territory. But she had faith in their bond. With twin roars, the two dragons took to the air. They climbed in widening spirals, rising high enough to feel the sting of crisp morning air on their faces. Once at altitude, they flew side by side across the rolling hills of the Crownlands. Maegor inclined his head to indicate a cluster of hills in the distance. He urged Earthbane forward with a commanding shout in Valyrian. The older dragon responded instantly, surging ahead with powerful strokes. Naerys pressed her knees against Ashfire's flanks. "Let's show them, my friend," she murmured. Ashfire launched into pursuit. His wings beat in a rapid rhythm at first, then he found a steadier pace. Earthbane might have had more raw power, but Ashfire proved agile, maneuvering in sudden bursts of speed. Naerys felt a thrill as they closed some of the gap. The wind tore at her hair. Ahead, Maegor glanced over his shoulder, and she could imagine the faint smile on his lips. He dipped Earthbane into a steep dive, testing if she dared follow. Naerys took a moment, gauging the angle, then signaled Ashfire with a lean of her body and a quiet word. The younger dragon folded his wings slightly and plunged downward, gathering momentum. The ground rushed up at a dizzying rate. Naerys' stomach clenched, but she trusted the bond. At the last moment, she guided Ashfire to snap his wings open, leveling out with a whoosh of air. Earthbane had done the same, but Ashfire's smaller frame allowed a sharper turn, letting them cut inside Earthbane's path. Maegor pulled up, letting Earthbane level. Naerys found herself gliding almost parallel to him, the two dragons exhaling puffs of smoke in the cold morning air. She could see the taut lines of concentration on Maegor's face. With a nod of approval, he ascended once more, and she followed. They spent nearly an hour in the sky, performing maneuvers over grassy fields and wooded groves. A few farm workers looked up and waved half-heartedly, anxious that the presence of so many dragons might bode ill for their harvest. In the end, the flight concluded near a wide, empty plain where a meandering river ran. Maegor landed first, Earthbane raising a cloud of dust. Naerys brought Ashfire down about 20 yards away, the impact jarring her teeth. She dismounted, breathless with exhilaration. Maegor strode over, removing his riding gloves. Behind him, Earthbane eyed Ashfire, huffing in a subdued challenge, but neither dragon advanced aggressively. "You're better than I expected," Maegor said, which was high praise from him. "Ashfire answers you, and you didn't balk at my sudden dives. I see you've inherited more than just our blood. You have courage." Naerys shrugged lightly, trying to hide her smile. "Thank you, uncle. He's a fine dragon." A moment passed, the two Targaryens side by side, their dragons occasionally puffing short bursts of flame. Maegor's expression grew thoughtful. "In time, you may prove a valuable ally to me and to the crown," he said. "I've been asked to lead a small contingent to inspect the Stepstones soon. I'd welcome you if you wish to join. We've had hints of trouble, pirates re-emerging, possibly with new backers. It's always easier to chase them off with more than one dragon overhead." Naerys inclined her head. "I'd be honored to help. I've patrolled that region briefly, but only by the king's behest." "Then so be it," Maegor said, retrieving a water skin from his saddlebag. He paused before taking a sip. "You do well to keep a keen eye. Not all pirates are the same rabble we've seen in the past. Some might carry curious weapons or illusions meant to distract dragons. There are talkative sell-sails in the free ports who claim new contraptions have emerged across the sea. Perhaps scorpions with poisoned bolts, or powders that burn in strange colors. Who can say?" She arched an eyebrow. "If we see such contraptions, I'll try not to let them surprise me." He almost smiled. "Good. Let's return before the day grows old. I have business at the Red Keep, and you likely have admirers waiting to congratulate you on your flight." She gave a half-laugh. "I'd rather not be fussed over. But yes, let's go." They mounted up and flew back to King's Landing. By the time they landed outside the dragon pit, the morning had matured into a hazy midday, the sun climbing higher. Observers greeted them, Some looked awed that the princess had flown so capably with the notoriously exacting Maegor. Court gossip would swirl around them for days. But Naerys scarcely cared for the intrigue. Her mind buzzed with the thrill of flight, the sense of possibility. Yet for all the wonder that the Targaryens brought to Westeros, disquiet never disappeared. Over in Old Town, the envoy the king had promised to send had finally arrived to speak with the Shadowbinder. This envoy was a scholarly Targaryen princeling named Galen, better known for his gentle manner than martial skill. He found Old Town vibrant with trade, the harbor bustling with ships from the Summer Isles, the summer sea shining bright in the midday sun. At the Citadel, archmesters debated the old arts, while the High Septon in the starry September fussed about moral questions. When Galen was at last admitted to speak with the mysterious Shadowbinder, who called herself Zerai of Ashai, he was ushered into a dimly lit chamber lined with black candles. The flicker of unnatural shadows set him on edge. Zerai was tall, veiled, her accent thick with Associ inflection. She claimed to have glimpsed a monstrous form rising in the deeps of the Sunset Sea, something stirring from the time before the first men. "It is old," she intoned, "older than your dragons, older than the spells that bound them. It waits in the blackness, stirring only when the seas grow too warm." She indicated swirling patterns in a metal bowl. Galen tried to keep his composure, recalling that many Shadowbinders sold illusions to gull the gullible. And yet, a small part of him remembered the White Walkers had once been dismissed as impossible, too. "What would you have of the crown?" Galen asked carefully. "Why come here and not speak to the king directly?" She let out a rasping laugh. "I come where the signs point me. Old Town is closer to the open sea than King's Landing. I prophesy doom on the waves. Dragons cannot fight what lurks beneath. Not easily, but you must be prepared." Galen frowned, unsure if he was witnessing genuine warning or a charlatan's performance. "Prepared how?" She raised a hand. "I can show your wise men the wards that might keep the old powers at bay. Rituals of fire and salt to bind the sea's wrath. But it will not come cheaply." Of course it came to a price. Galen half smiled to himself. Another scheme to fleece the gullible. Still, he knew that, centuries ago, the Targaryens had paid heavily for ignoring rumors of dark magic until the White Walkers had forced them to act. "I will relay your words to the crown," he said neutrally. "In the meantime, the Faith and the Citadel will weigh your claims." Zerai's veiled face betrayed no emotion. "Best weigh them quickly," she whispered. "In the east we have our own omens. The realm of men is perched on a slender thread of flame, more fragile than you imagine." Galen took his leave soon after, feeling an uneasy swirl in his stomach. Once back at the manse the crown provided for him, he penned a thorough report to King Aemon III. He expected the king to treat it with a mild courtesy. Still, Galen felt duty-bound to be thorough. Old nightmares lingered in Westeros, and the Targaryens of all people should not dismiss the improbable. When Galen's letter arrived at King's Landing, delivered by swift ship and rider, King Aemon III read it with his typical composure, his expression guarded. Over the years, he had entertained many forewarnings, some credible, some spurious. He recalled how so-called prophets had predicted that the White Walkers would ride giant ice spiders to overrun the south, predictions that never materialized. And yet, the others had indeed been real. He would not ignore the possibility that the seas held dangers unknown. So he convened a short council, read them the highlights of Galen's report, and concluded they would watch the coasts more carefully. This was all he deemed necessary for the moment. Some suggested sending a dragon rider to the far southwestern seas to scout. The king tabled the idea for now, wanting more tangible evidence before dispatching any Targaryen that far. While the monarchy weighed these distant threats, daily life in Westeros demanded attention. The harvest of that year was bountiful in the Reach, leading to caravans of grain traveling up to the Westerlands and beyond. The Iron Islands, subdued for generations by the threat of draconic retribution, kept mostly to fishing and the occasional reaving in the far north, carefully avoiding the crown's displeasure. The north itself, under House Stark, thrived in the post-war era. Some Starks even traveled south to the capital to offer respects and maintain friendly ties. In King's Landing, the sight of a Stark among so many Targaryens drew curiosity, pale northern features against the silver hair of Valyria's scions. Yet these small glimpses of diversity were overshadowed by the daily swirl of Targaryen politics. One afternoon, King Aemon III hosted a feast to honor a marriage pact between a Targaryen cousin and a younger daughter of House Martell. The feasting hall was decked with sun and spear banners interlaced with the three-headed dragon. Wine flowed, music played, and courtiers exchanged gossip. Prince Varen, the one who harbored resentment toward Naerys, lurked at the edges of the festivities, nursing a cup of spiced wine. He watched Naerys and her father with narrowed eyes as they stood in polite conversation near the dais. Beside him was a minor Targaryen lordling known for stirring trouble. "You see how she preens," the lordling murmured to Varen, nodding toward Naerys. "Everyone calls her bold now. They forget you outrank her." Varen's lips tightened. "She has her dragon. She hardly cares who outranks who." "That might be remedied," the lordling said in a low voice. "We could arrange an accident. Dragons can be unpredictable, or one might slip an irritant into its feed. A dose of poison, perhaps, enough to drive it mad, never directly pointing to you. If her dragon grows violent, the king might strip her of the right to ride." Varen froze. The idea repulsed him, yet a dark corner of his mind flickered with what might be possible. But he was not so far gone as to kill or maim a family member. "No," he said in a hushed tone. "That would spark suspicion on all of us. And I won't stoop to such means." The lordling bowed sarcastically. "As you wish, but mark me, her star is rising, and the realm loves a rider who soared without fear." Varen said nothing, turning away. He felt a gnawing sense of impotence. Perhaps if he found another dragon of his own. But each time he'd tried, the beasts had rejected him. He drank more wine, fuming. If there was one thing House Targaryen rarely forgave, it was any threat toward its dragons. Attempting such sabotage was near madness. He told himself he would not go down that path. Yet the seed of malice lay dormant, awaiting the right moment. In the midst of the feast, Princess Naerys slipped away from the throng. She'd never been fond of crowded halls and the endless flattery of courtiers. She drifted through a side corridor into a small courtyard garden, letting the cool night air wash over her. Torches flickered, illuminating the rose vines climbing the walls. She stood alone by a fountain, thinking of her next flight with Ashfire, replaying in her mind the moment of mutual trust when they soared above the city. There, she had felt both free and firmly bound to something larger than herself, an inheritance that stretched back to the Valyrian freehold, to the ruddy skies of legends. A gentle voice broke her reverie. "Princess Naerys?" She turned to see Lady Miranda Valerion, a distant cousin on her mother's side. Miranda was known for her skill at reading currents, both social and maritime, and she served as something of an informal advisor to the king's court. Tonight, she wore a deep blue gown embroidered with silver fish. She stepped closer, her expression contemplative. "Lady Miranda," Naerys said with a courteous nod. "You're missing the feast?" Miranda smiled faintly. "The feast misses nothing by my absence. I came here looking for a quiet moment. Seems you had the same idea." Naerys relaxed a bit, sensing no hidden agenda from Miranda. They exchanged small pleasantries about the wedding, the abundance of food, and the overexcited minstrels. Then Miranda leaned in slightly. "I have news from the docks. My father recently traded with a Braavosi captain who spoke of new contraptions in Tyros, mechanical wonders that can hurl bolts at great speed. They say they're made of black iron, etched with runes. Some even whisper they're designed to kill dragons." Naerys tensed. "That rumor surfaces every few years, though. Larger scorpions, stronger bows. The Targaryens always adapt." Miranda nodded. "Yes, of course. But I mention it because the captain said a wealthy patron from Volantis was paying double for as many as could be built. They might be stockpiling them in the Stepstones or on small islands off the coast. I thought you, or Prince Maegor, might like to know before your next patrol." A flicker of alarm passed through Naerys. That's valuable information indeed. Thank you, Miranda. I'll be sure Maegor hears of it at once. She paused, a tension in her voice. It's always the same story. Someone thinks they can outwit Dragonfire. Perhaps someday someone will. Miranda touched her arm gently. Don't borrow trouble, princess. Just be prepared. Naerys nodded solemnly. Thank you. I appreciate the warning. They parted ways, returning to the feast and their separate corners of the hall. But Naerys could not shake the sense of foreboding. Strange contraptions, scorpion-like weapons etched with runes. Over the centuries, the Targaryens had faced many attempts to replicate or subvert their advantage. Most had amounted to naught, but some had come dangerously close to drawing dragon's blood. She recalled the old stories of how the Dornish, in the time of Aegon I, had harried his forces with cunning ambushes. She also recalled how an assassin's arrow had once claimed the life of a young Targaryen prince on Dragonback, though the beast itself had survived. If a new alliance of foreign powers was quietly amassing weapons designed to slay dragons, the monarchy could not afford to dismiss it as rumor. The next day, she sought out Maegor, who was in the training yard sparring with a pair of knights. He fought with a Valyrian steel blade named Tempest's Edge, said to have been forged from a shard of the same steel as Dark Sister centuries before. Though older, Maegor was formidable. His swordwork was precise, punishing. He disarmed one knight, pivoted, and rapped the other's helm with the flat of his blade, leaving the man reeling. As they bowed in respect, Maegor turned to find Naerys watching from the sidelines. "A good morning to you," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Come to test me yourself?" She shook her head, stepping forward. "I have news from Lady Miranda Valerion. She's heard talk of new scorpion-like devices in Tyros possibly sold to Volantis. They're rumored to be specialized for dragons." Maegor eyed her. "I see. Another rumor from across the sea. Perhaps, but it aligns with what we've heard about Volantis stirring trouble. We should at least be aware. I know you're planning that trip to the Stepstones soon. Maybe it's worth investigating." She half expected a dismissive answer, but Maegor nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, it might be. We'll take Earthbane and Ashfire, plus a small retinue by ship. If these contraptions exist, I'd like to see them with my own eyes before deciding how seriously to take the threat." Naerys felt both relief and a spike of nerves. "When do we depart?" "In a week's time," he said. "I have a few more duties to see to first. If you're eager, you can ride ahead, but it's safer in numbers." "I'll wait," she replied. That evening, the king approved their plan to investigate. King Aemon III recognized the value of vigilance. He gave them his blessing, though he cautioned, "Do not start a war unless you must. A show of force might suffice to deter any illusions of challenging our rule." Maegor and Naerys agreed, acknowledging that the monarchy's goal was to keep the realm secure, not to spark a new conquest in Essos. Over the next days, they prepared. Ships were readied in the Blackwater Bay, swift galleys under Targaryen banners. Supplies were loaded, crews assembled. A small group of knights and archers, enough to handle pirates without drawing undue attention, were selected. Word spread that Prince Maegor and Princess Naerys would be touring the Stepstones to stamp out any renewed pirate threat. Officially, there was no mention of rumored scorpion devices. No point in telegraphing the monarchy's concerns. Finally, on the appointed morning, Earthbane and Ashfire took flight from King's Landing, soaring out over the bay, while the galleys beneath them cut through the waters. The sight reminded many watchers of the days of Aegon's Conquest. Dragon wings reflecting sunlight, a maritime escort forging ahead. Market stalls in the city paused their commerce as folk craned their necks, half in pride, half in dread, to see the silhouettes overhead. A few children shouted, "Long live the dragons!" The older folk simply watched in somber silence, remembering that if the Targaryens ever turned those dragons upon them, they had nowhere to hide. Within a day, the small fleet and its airborne guardians reached the Stepstones. The rocky islands jutted from the sea like the broken spine of a giant. Centuries past, pirates had infested these waters, but the Targaryens had cleared them out repeatedly. Now a handful of watchposts flew the royal banner, each garrisoned by a small contingent of men loyal to the crown. Maegor and Naerys landed near one such outpost, startling the stationed guards with the sudden thunder of dragon wings. As the watchers scurried to greet the royal riders, Maegor demanded a briefing. Any sign of suspicious ships? Rumors of new war machines in these parts. The outpost captain, a leathery-faced man named Ser Jason Clawfield, saluted smartly. Some unusual traffic from Tyros, my prince, but nothing overtly hostile. They keep to themselves. A few pirate raids near the southern straits. Likely scattered crews that refused to bow to your rule. We saw no sign of advanced weapons, but we'd hardly be privy if they hid them below decks. Maegor nodded curtly. We'll keep searching. Let's see if we can flush out any nest of trouble. Naerys listened, scanning the horizon where the sea glimmered. Ashfire shifted restlessly behind her, snapping at insects that buzzed around. She wondered if they might have come all this way for rumors that would prove hollow. Still, the memory of what the White Walkers once were, dismissed rumors, kept her from complacency. They spent 2 days scouting. Dragonback made it easy to cover vast stretches of sea, though the Stepstones had countless coves and hidden inlets. Maegor circled wide with Earthbane, occasionally spotting suspicious vessels and swooping low to startle them. Naerys took a more measured approach, letting her presence be known but focusing on areas said to have Tyroshi or Volantine activity. On the third morning, as she glided over a remote inlet near a craggy isle, she spotted what looked like a small fortress carved into the rock. A single ship lay anchored below. Its sails bore no clear insignia, but the vessel seemed sturdier than a typical pirate galley. She brought Ashfire down to circle overhead at a safe distance, keen eyes studying the fortress. No banners flew, no sign of obvious scorpions on the battlements, though there could be hidden emplacements. She decided not to approach alone. Dipping in the saddle, she signaled to a Targaryen outrider on a smaller boat below, a system of flags they'd established to coordinate. The outrider acknowledged her with a wave of colored cloth, then dispatched a swift skiff to find Maegor. When Maegor arrived with Earthbane, he sized up the fortress from the air. Almost looks abandoned, he remarked through the swirling wind. Naerys pointed out the anchored ship. The two Targaryens conferred briefly, then resolved to land on a narrow beach. Their knights, traveling by a small rowboat from the anchored war galley, joined them. Together, they moved up the rocky slope toward the fortress entrance. Maegor led, Tempest's edge at his hip. An eerie silence filled the courtyard inside. The stone walls were weathered by salt air, encrusted with barnacles in places. They found a couple of outbuildings, one apparently used as living quarters, the other containing crates of supplies. Inside those crates, they discovered crossbow bolts larger than typical, reinforced with steel heads. Nothing too shocking. Pirates sometimes used heavy crossbows, but these were etched with small runes that none recognized immediately. Some had a faint shimmer, almost as if coated in something akin to wildfire residue. Naerys exchanged a look with Maegor. This might be exactly what Miranda warned of. They pressed on, deeper into the fortress. The place seemed deserted, though a few footprints in the dust suggested recent occupation. At length, they came upon a locked iron door. Maegor motioned a knight forward with a heavy hammer. After several strikes, the door gave way. Beyond lay a cramped chamber lit by a single lantern. And there, amid a clutter of tools and half-finished mechanical devices, stood something resembling a small scorpion. A sturdy frame, a pivoting firing mechanism. Dark runes had been etched along the arms, each line painstakingly inlaid with a faintly greenish metal. A partial bolt lay loaded, its tip glinting with some unidentifiable coating. A man emerged from behind a stack of crates, hands raised in surrender, eyes wild with panic. He spoke in a babble of Tyroshi dialect. One of the Targaryen knights, who knew some Essosi tongues, ordered him to speak in the common tongue or Valyrian. The man stammered out that he was just a hired craftsman, paid by a merchant from Volantis to assemble these contraptions. He insisted he had no idea what they were truly for, that he simply followed instructions from an old scroll. Maegor's gaze darkened, and he pressed a hand to the scorpion's metal frame. "Have you tested it on a dragon?" The craftsman shook his head vigorously. No, never. We haven't found one to test. The merchant said we only needed to build them, store them until further notice. That's all." Naerys studied the scorpion's intricate carvings. It looked more advanced than the old scorpions from the days of Aegon's conquest. The runes were reminiscent of old spells, though she lacked the expertise to interpret them. Her skin prickled at the thought that some entity across the sea was systematically upgrading these machines to kill dragons, or at least to try. "Where is everyone else?" she asked the trembling craftsman. He stammered, "Gone, my lady. A warship came from Tyros a few days ago. Some men left with crates. I was told to stay behind to finish this piece. They said they'd return soon." Maegor exhaled sharply, turning to Naerys. "So they're spread across the islands, or perhaps they sailed onward. We need to find them." Naerys agreed, her mind racing. "We should destroy this workshop, along with any completed weapons. Let them see we won't tolerate such craft aimed at us. But we should also keep evidence for the crown. Proof that Volantine merchants are behind this." Maegor nodded, turning to the knights. "Gather everything you can, but carefully. Some of these materials might be flammable or toxic. Then set charges and burn this place to the ground." The knights obeyed, rounding up crates of bolts, parchments with scribbled notes, and a few spare mechanical parts. The craftsman, sweat beading on his brow, pleaded for mercy. Maegor, after a moment of thought, said, "We'll bring you with us. You can speak to the King's Council if you're telling the truth." He gestured for two knights to seize the man. The craftsman offered no resistance, probably relieved he wouldn't be slain on the spot. They emerged into the courtyard, loaded with the seized contraband. Maegor used a short fuse of dragonfire-laced powder to set the fortress interior ablaze. A pungent smoke rose, black and greasy, as the runic scorpion and tools were consumed. Soon, flames roared out the windows, sending sparks flying into the sky. Naerys exchanged a grim look with her uncle. "They won't build more here, at least." He nodded. "But we must root them out entirely. One nest destroyed means little if a dozen more remain." They departed quickly, returning to their anchored war galley. The craftsman sat in chains, shuddering as the knights questioned him in broken Tyroshi. Through the half-coherent replies, they gleaned that a certain Volantine merchant prince named Rhaegar Mavas had financed the operation. Rumors said Mavas was obsessed with collecting relics of Valyrian design. He had a retinue that included a couple of red priests and a learned scholar from Karth who claimed knowledge of runes. They were rumored to be scouring the Stepstones for safe hideouts, apparently stockpiling these devices for some bigger scheme, perhaps to threaten or blackmail the Targaryens, or to undermine their hold on the seas. With that knowledge, Maegor and Naerys launched a more systematic search. Over the next week, they visited each known cove, fort, or pirate den with a ruthless efficiency. Sometimes they found nothing but scuttled ships. Other times they discovered caches of large crossbow parts, incomplete or poorly assembled, tucked away in hidden caves. They heard conflicting rumors. Some said Mavas had left for Lys, others that he was bound for the Basilisk Isles, others that he was returning to Volantis to present his dragon-killing marvels to the Triarchs. If so, the Targaryens might soon have a confrontation with Volantis. At last, with no further leads to chase in the immediate area, Maegor decided to return to King's Landing, bringing the captive craftsman and all the gathered evidence. Naerys concurred. They needed the king's backing, and perhaps the crown's broader intelligence network, to track Mavas if he had indeed fled. The presence of runic scorpions was a threat that could not be ignored. If enough such devices were mass-produced, even the monarchy's dozens of dragons might be in danger, especially if the scorpions were fitted on ships, able to fire from many angles. Dragon riders could be overwhelmed by crossfire. So the small flotilla sailed back to Blackwater Bay, overshadowed by Earthbane and Ashfire. Their departure from the Stepstones did not go unnoticed by local inhabitants, but few dared to impede Targaryens in open water. After an uneventful voyage, They arrived in the capital under gray skies. King Aemon III, informed of their findings, wasted no time summoning a special council. Maegor laid out the seized crossbow bolts, each bearing eerie runic etchings. Naerys described the scorpion's design and the fortress workshop. The captured craftsman, trembling under guard, was allowed to speak, though the king had him kept in irons to discourage any falsehood. He repeated the name Roger Mavas, elaborating that the man boasted of superior knowledge gleaned from Valyrian fragments. The council stirred with apprehension. Master of Whisperers Orlan Celtigar tapped the table with anxious fingers. Volantis, a proud city, a wealthy city. If they're truly behind this, it might spark war. Are we prepared for a large-scale conflict across the sea? Our own coffers are strong, but the free cities combined can muster formidable fleets. Maegor snorted. A few scorpions on rickety ships won't best our dragons. Let them try. King Aemon III raised a hand for silence. We must tread carefully. We do not want to replicate the mistakes of Valyria, spreading ourselves thin on foreign wars. But we also cannot let them develop a doomsday device for dragons. The discussion roiled. Some advised immediate aggression. Send a flight of dragons to burn the Volantine shipyards, making an example of them before they grew too bold. Others counseled patience. Use diplomacy. Offer a warning that any attempt to undermine Targaryen sovereignty with such weapons would bring dire consequences. The king leaned toward caution. He had fought in the north, faced unimaginable foes, and come away knowing that overreach could lead to disaster. In the end, the crown decided on a two-pronged approach. First, they would dispatch a formal envoy to Volantis, instructing the Triarchs that any development of scorpion-like weapons designed to kill dragons would be considered an act of hostility. Second, the monarchy would quietly fortify its own defenses, placing watchers along the coasts and sending a few more riders to the Stepstones to ensure swift retaliation if needed. Maegor volunteered to lead the direct approach, but the king chose a different path. He wanted a more diplomatic Targaryen to handle the envoy mission, someone who might not set the entire city ablaze with a single provocation. A consensus soon formed around Prince Galen, the same scholarly Targaryen who had gone to Old Town to speak with the Shadowbinder. He was measured, polite, and not prone to fury. Maegor did not hide his displeasure at being passed over, but he grudgingly accepted. As for Princess Naerys, her part in exposing the workshop and reclaiming contraband only boosted her standing at court. The small folk told tales of her bold flights over the Stepstones, how she coaxed out hidden pirates with minimal bloodshed. Some courtiers named her the Realm's Wing, praising her vigilance. This did not go unnoticed by Prince Varen or other Targaryens with an eye for status. Whispers circulated that if the king's primary heir, a mild-mannered prince named Aerys, proved too weak or uninterested in rule, the crown might well fall on Naerys' head one day. She herself seemed indifferent to such speculation. She cared for flying, for the realm's safety, not for wearing the burden of the crown. Still, the monarchy's relative unity held. No open faction threatened war from within. The Targaryens collectively recognized that squabbling among themselves while an external force plotted the downfall of dragons would be foolhardy. They had learned from centuries of near conflict that external threats often forced them to close ranks. For the moment, at least, the lines of kinship held firm. In the weeks that followed, Prince Galen organized his journey to Volantis. He prepared gifts for the Triarchs: fine wines, golden cups, and tapestries depicting Targaryen victories. He also brought a retinue of a dozen knights, a few learned maesters, and one lesser dragon rider on a small but swift drake named Emberwing, purely as a statement of Targaryen might. Galen himself did not ride a dragon, though he possessed the silver hair and violet eyes of his lineage. He had never bonded with a beast, preferring books to flight. But the presence of Emberwing would remind Volantis that House Targaryen could descend in force if provoked. Before Galen departed, King Aemon III cautioned him, "Offer the Triarchs a path to peace. We want them to renounce any involvement in the Scorpion plots and punish those responsible. But if they deny it or show signs of treachery, do not linger. Return at once, and we'll prepare stronger measures." Galen bowed. "I'll do my utmost, your grace." While Galen sailed off across the narrow sea, the realm continued its daily rhythms. Princess Naerys resumed her flights with Ashfire, sometimes patrolling the crownlands, sometimes exploring further into the Reach. She conversed with local lords, ensuring they knew the crown had not grown complacent. Her direct style, lacking some of the stifling court formality, endeared her to many knights and minor lords who found higher Targaryens intimidating. One day, while visiting Highgarden at the Mander's invitation, Naerys indulged in a flight over the lush fields. She landed near a rose garden, to the gasps of gardeners who feared a stray ember might destroy their prized blooms. Carefully controlling Ashfire, she hopped down and let the beast hunt for deer in a nearby forest instead. There, in Highgarden's storied courtyards, she encountered an old statue of Aegon the Conqueror with an inscription praising the peaceful unity brought by dragonfire. She found herself pondering the paradox. Fire and blood had united the realm, but at what cost to freedom? Did it matter, given that the result was centuries of relative stability and a victorious stand against the others? She was still lost in thought when the steward of Highgarden informed her that a messenger from King's Landing had just arrived with urgent news. He hastened to read the scroll. It bore her father's seal. The message stated that an incident had occurred in the waters east of Dorne. A Tyroshi fleet confronted a Targaryen patrol. No dragons were involved, but the Tyroshi apparently fired upon the patrol's ships with heavy crossbows. Casualties were light, but the aggression signaled that the tension with the free cities might be escalating faster than the crown anticipated. The messenger said the king requested her immediate return, for she might be needed if the situation worsened. Naerys wasted no time. She thanked the Lord of Highgarden for his hospitality, mounted Ashfire, and soared north. The flight back to King's Landing took less than a day, though she made a brief stop to rest. Upon arrival, she found the Red Keep in a state of heightened alert. Word had spread that the Tyroshi had seized a small Targaryen-flagged vessel, imprisoning its crew on suspicion of spying. The crown demanded their release. Tyros retorted that the Targaryens had no right to patrol those waters, calling it neutral territory. Tensions rose. Some lords thirsted for battle, insisting that the Targaryens storm Tyros with dragons and lay waste to their fleets. King Aemon III in council struggled to maintain calm. He had not heard from Galen in Volantis yet, so they lacked clarity on the broader situation. Maegor naturally advocated for a show of force if not an outright strike. "Better to remind them of who they're dealing with now," he said grimly. Others, more cautious, urged a measured response, perhaps blockading Tyros's harbors until the hostages were freed. Naerys found herself torn. She understood that ceding ground might embolden the free cities, but she also recalled her father's warnings about overreach. While they debated, fresh news arrived from the north. A savage band of raiders had come across the frozen seas east of the Shadow Tower, carrying strange weapons of ice. The Night's Watch repelled them with some difficulty, losing a dozen men. The raiders, rumored to be a mix of wildlings and something else, vanished back into the blizzards. It seemed there was no end to the realm's burdens. The Targaryens had to manage both an imminent threat from the sea to the south and a potential stirring in the frigid extremes of the north. Such was the perennial challenge of a dynasty that spanned a continent. Their dragons offered swift movement and overwhelming firepower, but the realm was vast, and cunning foes might always strike at vulnerable points. King Aemon III, weighed by these concerns, confided privately in Naerys one evening in the Royal Solar. Over a quiet dinner, he said, "Sometimes I wonder if our forebears were wise to continue expanding the dragon breed. So many beasts to maintain. Our family has grown large and fractious. We hold the realm together through awe, but it's a constant dance to avoid letting that awe turn to rage." Naerys listened with sympathy. "We have problems, yes, but you've kept the realm safe for decades. And when the White Walkers came, we triumphed. That is no small thing." Her father's eyes lingered on the flickering candle. "True, yet the realm's memory is short. They forget the threat from the north, and they fear our dragons more than they love them. Now the free cities conspire with Runic scorpions. The north might still harbor unknown terrors, and discontent stirs among those who resent our overlordship. I worry for the day I pass. Will the next generation keep the balance? Or might a single spark ignite a war that engulfs us all? Dragons or no? Naerys placed a hand over his. I believe the next generation will endure, Father. We've learned from past mistakes. We won't repeat another dance of dragons. We stand united against external threats. And we have people like Uncle Maegor, Prince Galen, and yourself each offering different strengths. We can do this. He studied her face, perhaps searching for signs of youthful naivete or hidden doubt. Then he squeezed her hand. I pray you're right. Days later, new tidings came from Volantis. Prince Galen had arrived, was granted an audience with the Triarchs, and negotiations were underway. It was too soon to say if they would succeed. Tyros, however, remained belligerent. Reports indicated they had mobilized more ships in the disputed waters near the Stepstones, presumably to guard against Targaryen intimidation. The tension threatened to escalate into a naval skirmish at any moment. Amid these developments, King Aemon III resolved to send an emissary to Tyros, someone who could either calm the situation or, if necessary, signal the crown for a decisive strike. Maegor volunteered again, but the king hesitated. Maegor was not known for his diplomatic finesse. The king glanced at Naerys, then at his other children. After a quiet moment, he said, Naerys, you have a steadier hand in dealing with strangers. I would trust you to speak softly first. If they yield and free our people, good. If not, he left the threat unspoken. Naerys felt her pulse quicken. Another mission across the sea, possibly stepping into the jaws of hostility. But she knew why her father chose her. She had a knack for forging reluctant respect, and yet she commanded a fearsome dragon. I'll do my best, she said, meeting her father's gaze. Thus it was that Princess Naerys prepared to sail and fly south to Tyros. She assembled a retinue of loyal knights, a few lords with experience in associate negotiations, and also took along the lesser Targaryen cousin who had a small dragon of his own for added security. She planned to meet Tyroshi leaders, demand the release of Targaryen prisoners, and glean whether they were truly forging an alliance with Volantis or simply acting on their own. If all went well, she could avert a war. If not, the monarchy might find itself unleashing dragons upon a city that had seen countless wars but never a full Targaryen assault. On a drizzly morning, she mounted Ashfire on the decks of a Targaryen war galley. The plan was to fly in tandem with the ship for part of the journey, then land on the vessel when needed, letting the sailors handle the daily chores of travel. As they set sail, a small crowd watched from the docks, uneasy about the possibility of war. Naerys inhaled the briny air, feeling the sea spray on her face. She whispered to Ashfire, steadying him as the deck lurched. The dragon's claws scraped against the planks, but the creature tolerated it, having grown accustomed to ships during the Stepstones mission. They set forth, an uncertain journey into potential conflict. King Aemon III watched them disappear into the morning mist, his expression pensive. Maegor stood beside him, fists clenched behind his back. She'll do well, Maegor said quietly, as if trying to reassure both the king and himself. She must, the king replied, turning to walk back into the Red Keep. We can't let this spiral into open war, not while so many other threats linger beyond our shores. And so Princess Naerys sailed south, bearing both the olive branch and the flaming sword of Targaryen might. The future of Westeros, once more, hung on the precarious interplay of House Targaryen's power and the cunning ambitions of distant cities. Dragons soared above the waves, a living symbol of monarchy forged in fire. Whether that fire would bring light or devastation remained to be seen. If the Targaryens had learned anything from centuries of unbroken rule, it was this. The line between security and tyranny was thin as a sword's edge, and the realm's fate depended on how carefully they walked that edge with dragons at their command. If they faltered, the long shadow of Valyria's doom might yet stretch across the world once more. But if they succeeded, Westeros would continue under a dynasty of living flame, a tapestry of ambition and tradition woven together by scaled wings across its skies, both a bulwark against the dark and a reminder that absolute power can never rest easy.